All right. How's it going, everyone? Welcome back. This evening, I'm going to be doing a review of this video that I saw just the other day. Well, I haven't watched it yet, but I saw its existence. I was just saying this. We need different words for like seeing that something exists versus like watching it. It's confusing that we don't have separate words. Anyway, my old friend William Lane Craig, about whom I wrote my first book. I'll actually just pull that up to show you. I don't have a physical copy with me here in the US. That was an oversight. But anyway, Craig, I actually sent an invitation through his website to have a discussion with me, but apparently he's too busy. Not too busy to go on these sorts of programs, though. So Craig's going to be talking about the state of the discourse with respect to arguments for the existence of God from natural theology, and what he's written about that in his new book, his systematic theology, which I have not read, I should say, although I'm very doubtful that there's much new in it, given how little new there is in most of his other works. But I mean, I could be wrong. Anyway, let's see what they talk.
Thanks for coming back. It's always a treat to have you on.
Always enjoy doing your show, Sean.
Well, let's jump right in. And this question might be this first one that I'm most curious about, because you've been defending the existence of God for more than 4 decades in debates and in writings and in conversation. How would you assess the state of the debate today versus when you began?
I think that there has been a tremendous revival of interest in the arguments of natural theology over the last generation. The number of philosophers working on these arguments includes some of the best philosophers working today. And so this is really a flourishing cottage industry, I think.
Well, one of the most articulate and thoughtful critics of this movement would be Graham Oppy, and he's claimed that there are no good theistic arguments. Why do you differ with him? And what are the criteria in your mind that you think makes an argument good?
I have a discussion of this question in the introduction to this volume, and I think that Professor Oppy sets the standard for what counts as a good argument unrealistically high. He measures an argument's goodness by its success in persuading people to change their minds. But I don't think that the goodness of an argument is measured by its success, which could be impeded by all sorts of psychological and other factors. And what counts as success? Well, according to Oppy's account, a successful argument is one that ought to persuade all reasonable people who have reasonable views about the matter to change their minds. Well, that is unrealistically high as a standard of success. On that basis, there are no good philosophical arguments for anything, including Oppy's own arguments. So the standard of success, persuading all reasonable people, is simply unrealistic. I think that
a lot seems to be hanging on how you define reasonable there. But there are actually a lot of arguments in philosophy that succeed in convincing at least most philosophers. It's just that they're not usually like final arguments. They're usually arguments that certain views don't work, for example. I think that Craig is overstating the case there, but anyway.
Arguments that I present are good arguments. They are deductive arguments, and a good deductive argument must be logically valid, have true premises, and then have premises that are supported by the evidence in such a way as to have a particular epistemic value for us. Now, exactly what that value is very difficult to say. It certainly doesn't need to be certainty. Is it probability, plausibility? Well, in the theistic arguments that I defend, I think that the probability of the conjunction of their premises is in every case pretty clearly greater than 50%. So that these arguments demonstrate their conclusions to be more probable than not, and therefore, in my judgment, they are very good arguments.
Craig says that Oppy has too low a bar for what counts as a good argument, but Craig's bar is just that the argument is sound, and that the conjunctive probability of the premises is just greater than 50%. That's an unbelievably low bar for a deductive argument, that it's just like more likely than not. So that's not even sufficient. Like, that sort of argument would not be sufficient to publish a scientific paper, for example. Not that you usually base those on like deductive arguments, but like just greater than 50% would not be sufficient. Like this sort of standard p-value that's used is like 0.05, which you can't read that as a literal probability of the hypothesis being true, but like 50% is certainly not going to be sufficient for publishing a paper. In the legal system, in criminal law, it's the same thing. You need to have the prosecution has to meet the standard of beyond reasonable doubt not just greater than 50%. So it's interesting to me that Craig, I mean, I'm not going to say that I have a particular account of exactly what makes a good argument. I'm not that interested in deductive arguments in philosophy, for instance. So that's a bit different there. But I would say that defining it as just an argument that is valid and sound and whose premises are in the conjunction of the premises is more than 50% likely, it just seems to me an incredibly low bar. And in fact, the thing is that it's possible to have good arguments whose conclusions are opposite, whose premises are, well, it depends how you condition your probabilities, right? But like with conditioning on slightly different information, you can easily have arguments for the same, for opposing conclusions, but with premises in each of them that are more than 50% likely to be true if you just condition on slightly different information. I guess that's not true if you condition on everything, but you can never condition on everything when you sort of evaluate these arguments. So like, it's just a really low, it's a really low bar. So I don't really, I mean, I guess it's apologetically convenient to define a very low bar for yourself and then congratulate yourself for how easy it is that you've, how well you've done in achieving that low bar, or, recovering that low bar. Question here, who would you say is the best Christian apologist ranked by skilled argumentation? Well, in terms of like skill with debate, I think Craig is probably the best I've seen because he's a very good public debater. That doesn't mean his arguments are any good. In terms of who has the best arguments, I don't know. I don't have a very high opinion of apologists, sort of because of the nature of the enterprise. I think that it's intellectually dishonest to varying degrees, though. I'm not going to say every apologist is. So I don't have a favorite apologist. If anyone has any suggestions, please let me know. I do think that some are worse than others, though. Anyway, let's move on.
I really appreciate that point that we're not talking about certainty, but more probable than not. And of course, leaning into what's the best explanation for some of these phenomena. Now, you have 6 arguments here. And for each one, I'm going to ask you to just kind of briefly explain what the argument is. And then I'll have at least one objection to one of these, to each of these.
Oh, by the way, so I don't know what these 6 arguments are that he's presenting, but I'm going to see if I can guess them, although this isn't like much of a guess because I've read a lot of Craig's previous work, but I haven't read anything that he's published in the last like 5 years or so. So the ones that he's traditionally defended would be, he had a standard debate template, which I think he's moved a little bit away from, but this was the 5 argument approach. And the 5th one is not really an argument. It's like, you can know for yourself that Christianity is true through the Holy Spirit. I'm going to guess that he probably doesn't present that in systematic theology, but I could be wrong there. So the first 4, though, would be, the first 4 that he would traditionally present would be Kalam, cosmological argument, fine-tuning argument, moral argument, and argument for the resurrection of Jesus. The last, which Jesus one, is also not really an argument for the existence of God, because you can only really get that argument going if you already postulate God and a bunch of other beliefs about him. It's more an argument for Christianity. But those were 4 that he traditionally argued for. And then more recently, in some of his more recent debates, he added to that the, the Leibnizian cosmological argument, which is really quite similar to the Kalam, but with some subtle variations on. Instead of postulating a first cause, it postulates an explanation for the existence of, like, for the existence of everything, like why does something exist rather than nothing. And he's also argued for, Craig has also argued for the, what's his name, Wigner, the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics. Was there another one that he's argued for? I feel like that there's another one I've forgotten, but I think those are the, oh, that's right. Yes, I remember. And another one that he's defended more recently is intentionality, or in other words, that you can't explain intentionality without an appeal to God or something like that. That's 7 though. So I'm not sure which of those he might have dropped. So we'll see.
And then invite your response. And again, people watching going, wait a minute, there's more objection than this. Write your objections in, and we'll be back live Tuesday.
I guess if this is like, if this is for the existence of God specifically, then the resurrection might not be there. So maybe it's those other ones. Let's see.
4:30 with a professor from Talbot School of Theology in the Philosophy of Apologetics department, and we will do our best to respond to those as well. So let's start with the argument from contingency. What's that argument?
This argument asks the question, why does anything at all exist?
Okay, so this is the Leibnizian cosmological argument.
Nothing. And I think a persuasive formulation of this argument is as follows. Premise 1, everything that exists has an explanation of its existence, either in the necessity of its own nature or in an external cause. 2, If the universe has an explanation of its existence, that explanation is God. And 3, the universe exists. Now, from those 3 simple premises, it follows with logical necessity that therefore the universe...
It's so stupid that Craig's... Yeah, this is the same shtick he's been doing for decades. If you're going to argue that the conjunction of your premises only needs to be true with greater than 50% probability, then using this language of like following with logical certainty is just pure rhetoric. Like, it's just pure flourish. It doesn't do anything. Like, all it means is that the conclusion is just as probable as the conjunction of the premises, because you don't lose any probability going from the premises to the conclusion because it's a deductive argument, right? But Craig's not claiming to establish his premises with like certainty. So like, what difference does it make if you lose a little bit of probability or not? Like, it's kind of irrelevant. All that matters is how plausible is the argument, or like how probable does it render the conclusion given the plausibility of the premises and the plausibility of the conjunction of the plausibility of the conjunction of the premises and whether the argument is valid. So it really annoys me that he continues to talk in this way, as if like the argument being, when you're constructing a deductive argument, the fact that it's valid is somehow something to celebrate and jump up and down about by using this logical, certainty or whatever he says. It's just silly. Like, why talk like this?
Has an explanation of its existence, and from that it follows that therefore the explanation of the universe is God. Those are the premises of the argument. I don't have time in our interview today to defend them, but you can look at the book for detailed defenses of each of the premises.
I'm trying to remember how he defends the idea that everything has an explanation. I think it's the usual, like, it's just an appeal to intuition, essentially, that there just like has to be a reason why we have something rather than nothing, because you can't sort of fathom why it would exist otherwise. I forget the specifics. He spent a lot more time defending Kalam, at least traditionally, so that's what I spend most of my time in my book discussing. By the way, I will just show that while I remember it. Why does it say... Oh, I guess I can only share one. That's annoying. Maybe I can... Oh, okay. I can only have one screen. That is irritating. Well, I just wanted to show my book here. This is what it is, Unreasonable Faith, How William Lane Craig Overstates the Case for Christianity. You can get that in paperback or Kindle form. Check that out if you're interested in what I have to say about his arguments in more detail. So let's go back to the... Nope. Let's go back to the video. Why can't I create more than one share at once? That's very irritating.
I interviewed 100 apologists for what they...
Oh, that was the other thing I was going to say. So the idea that you can establish that everything has an explanation just by thinking about it is one of the silliest things, well, one of the sillier things that I think one can claim. I don't think Craig even explains defines what an explanation is very clearly, particularly if you think an explanation is an epistemic entity, as in like an explanation is a sentence or it's a theory or it's a set of ideas or something like that. Like, an explanation isn't a thing in the world. It's like, how can you say that everything has an explanation? A lot of things won't have explanations unless we come up with the explanation, right? Now, you could say, well, maybe he means cause, but that's explicitly not what he means, because that's the Kalam cosmological argument. So I think it's almost a category mistake to say that like everything has to have an explanation, because explanations aren't even things in the world. They're constructs, essentially. I guess you could say, well, it's in the mind of God, but then that's sort of question begging as well. So it's just a profoundly silly argument. It's also kind of weird that like, even if you're giving a summary of an argument, presenting the premises and then thumping the table about how deductively certain the conclusion is just a really silly way to defend it. Like, why not say something, even in brief, about why we should think that the universe has an explanation and why that explanation should be God? I just think, it's not a very convincing way to try to defend the argument. So premise one is pretty suspicious. And then premise two, like, well, it has to be God. Look, even if the universe does need an explanation, the idea that it has to be God and with all of these properties of like omnipotence and omniscience and so forth is just basically not argued for. It's the same in the Kalam. They just introduced from essentially nothing. But anyway, since he's not going to say much about it here, I'll just move
the
on.
best argument. The one we're coming to next is the one that you considered the best or your favorite argument. Only one Protestant, I'm sorry, not a single Protestant apologist mentioned the contingency argument. It was only...
No, as I said, I have invited him to, well, I've, unfortunate freeze frame there. No, I put out a video challenging him to a debate, and I also contacted the, what is it, Reasonable Faith Ministry. But I did get a response, and they just said he's too busy, essentially. Unfortunate, but I didn't really expect that he would want to. I don't have a particularly large platform, and so there's not really a reason for him to do it. But anyway.
And then he followed up and got a whole bunch of Catholic philosophers and apologists who view this as the most compelling argument. So that,
yes, people like Alexander Pruss, for example, who is Catholic, has written extensively in defense of the contingency argument.
So part of the argument is if things exist, then either
we
it
are
comes
talking
from
about
their contingent, they come from something that's necessary, or the things such as God, or somebody could argue maybe the laws of logic in some sense necessarily exist. Perhaps the most common objection I've heard to this is people say, well, the universe exists necessarily. It's a brute fact. Things in the universe, and sometimes they'll put a nuance and say, well, even if things...
Brute fact is not the same as existing necessarily. A brute fact is just something that doesn't have an explanation. It could be, I mean, some people think there are brute contingencies, right? So that shouldn't be conflated.
The universe are contingent. The universe itself is not. So what would be your response to that common objection?
This is actually two different objections, Sean. To say that the existence of the universe is a brute fact is to say that the universe exists contingently, but without any explanation.
This is what I was just saying.
For why it exists rather than not. And I think the problem with this objection is that it commits what Alexander Pruss calls the taxicab fallacy. That is to say, it assumes that you can just dismiss the principle of sufficient reason like a taxicab whenever you want to. And it is...
But the principle of sufficient reason is just something that people say, right? Like, this is just classic reversing the burden of proof. Like, Craig is saying that his premises are more plausible than, or the conjunction of them is more plausible than not. So he needs to tell us why. What he can't do is respond to a criticism and just say, oh, well, they haven't given us reason to think that the principle of sufficient reason is false, so we'll just go on believing that it's true. I mean, the principle of sufficient reason isn't established. It's just something that people came up with. Like, why should we think that it's true? Even if we think that it's true of everything within the universe, by the way, you could think that every event that happens in the universe has an explanation or a reason why it happens. But that doesn't mean that the conjunction of all events, like the universe itself, has an explanation. That's one argument that people give for it. They're like, well, everything that we find in the universe has an explanation or like a reason why it happens rather than not. But it's a fallacy of composition to say that therefore everything must, or a mereological fallacy of like the relation between the parts and the whole of things, to say that therefore that the totality of everything, which is what we mean by the universe here, must have an explanation or a reason for its existence. It's just speculation when people say this. We actually have absolutely no idea how our concepts of like reason and explanation even apply to like the totality of existence, or the totality of the physical universe at least. So I don't know if the totality of existence has a reason for its existence or not. I think I would lean not, but like that's going to depend on a whole bunch of considerations as to how we assess those terms. And it's just very frustrating, which is a classic thing Craig does, though, that when someone presents an objection, he just flips it and saying, oh, well, yeah, but you haven't given us a reason to reject the principle of sufficient reason, as if he doesn't have to give it. He's the one making the argument and he needs to give us an explanation for why we should accept the principle of sufficient reason. Obviously, if you accept that, then you're going to accept the premise, or at least you're much more likely to. But that's the whole point. Like, why should we accept that the principle of sufficient reason?
Arbitrary and unjustified to dismiss that principle when you come to the universe. Richard Taylor, the great metaphysician.
It's not arbitrary to say that the totality of all things might have different properties than anything in that set. Like, in other words, that a set of things, the set of everything, might have different properties than any element of that set. That's not arbitrary. That's actually quite common. Like, for example, the set of natural numbers, any, that's just like 1, 2, 3, and so forth. Any element of that set is finite. It's a single number, but the set of all of them is infinite. That has a totally different set of properties than any element of the set. I mean, this is not uncommon in mathematics or even in the world, but we're talking about the totality of existence. I think it's just arbitrary to make the assumption that it would have the same set of properties. So again, this is just like shifting the burden of proof for people who are skeptical of Craig's argument. now have to say why the premises are false instead of Craig having to say why we should think that they're true.
Gave a wonderful illustration of this point. He said, imagine you're walking in the woods and you come across a ball lying on the floor of the forest. You would naturally wonder how it came to be there. And if someone said to you, oh, don't ask that question, it just exists inexplicably, you wouldn't accept that. Now, Taylor said, suppose the ball were the size of an automobile. Same question. Suppose it were the size of a house. Same question. Suppose it were the size of a planet. Same question. Suppose it were the size of the universe. Same question. Merely increasing the size of the object does nothing to obviate the need for an explanation of its existence. And therefore, those who try to exempt the universe from the principle of sufficient reason, I think, are guilty of the taxicab fallacy.
This is such a moronically dumb argument. I actually don't understand how any thoughtful person can think this is convincing. So obviously, everyone's going to accept that if you just found a ball somewhere, that would need an explanation for how it got there, or like what it's doing there, or where it came from. Balls don't just exist, right? We all know that. We all know that objects in the physical universe, especially things that appear to be artifacts, but even natural things, right? They come from somewhere. They have explanations. There's a series of causes that accounts for why it's there. No one disputes this. I mean, maybe we could argue about quantum events or something like that, but macroscopic objects, yeah, like they have explanations. Now, can anyone think of a difference between the universe? And remember here, when we say universe, we don't even necessarily mean like our region of space-time that is contiguous with the expanding space-time that traces back to the Big Bang. Like we actually mean all of physical existence, the totality of everything. So it could be multiverse, it could be many different parts of the universe that we're not even causally connected to, right? So can anyone think of a difference between the totality of physical existence and a ball, whether that ball is very large or small? Okay, so one obvious difference is that one of those things is a physical object within space-time, and the other is space-time itself and everything that is in it. Like, just maybe space and time and everything that's in it has different properties than physical objects that exist within space-time. In fact, I think that there's very good reason to think that that might be the case. It's not that it's a ball that gets bigger. The universe isn't a ball. It's everything that exists. It's, again, this is confusing items within a set with the set as a whole. And in fact, it's bizarre because this is exactly what theists complain that atheists do. They say, well, atheists just treat God as some other thing in the universe, like a man in the sky. But that's not what God is. God is supposed to be, well, that depends who you ask, but God is supposed to be more than the universe. He is supposed to be the ground of all being, and he's supposed to be omnipresent and whatever else, right? It's not just another thing that exists in the universe. But then somehow when we're making this contingency argument, that sort of reasoning goes out the window. And now we're thinking of the universe as just like a thing in the universe. That doesn't even make any sense. Yeah, obviously balls have explanations, and even very large ones would, but that's not what the universe is. The universe isn't a thing inside itself. It's the totality of existence. It's not at all arbitrary to think that it has different properties, especially modal properties, meaning like, could it have been different? That's what he's asking about here when he's asking about whether it's necessary or contingent. Like, could it be different? Very difficult to assess modal properties of things like this that we know very little about. So it's just such a stupid argument. Why anyone would even bother with it is totally beyond me.
Now, the other objection you mentioned is much more radical.
Just a bigger ball.
It says that the universe, yes, does have an explanation of its existence. Namely, the universe exists by a necessity of its own nature. And I think this is enormously implausible and therefore has attracted very few proponents. Scientific.
I don't know if that's true or not, that it's attracted very few proponents, but I'm not sure. I don't know if I've seen data on that, but I'm not sure that Craig has either.
Speaking, the universe seems to be contingent. For example, physicists explore different alternative models of the universe than the standard model of particle physics. Many have explored string theory, for example, and that is a different universe. And no one would refute string theory by saying it's metaphysically impossible. This is a scientific question to be settled by the evidence, not by metaphysics. Or think of different cosmological models of the universe, the steady state model, oscillating models, vacuum fluctuation models. The universe, scientifically speaking, seems clearly contingent. Now,
Craig is talking about different models of the universe, fundamental particles or the origins of the universe, but none of those things say anything about the universe as a whole, whether it's contingent or not. It's likely that science can't say anything about that in principle. because there's always going to be limitations of what we can observe, and how far back we can reason about in time. I mean, perhaps we'll overcome those someday, but certainly any of our current theories have limitations, and they apply to the parts like the observable universe or parts of it that we have been we've been causally in contact with at some point in the past. Like, the fact that the universe began with the Big Bang 13.8 billion years ago, that doesn't mean that the universe in the sense here had an origin. And for all we know, that we could be a part of a much larger multiverse, which is existed forever, or which exists necessarily. It's so frustrating because Craig clearly says this when it's inconvenient, when scientific results are inconvenient for him. He says, well, we can interpret them instrumentally, which means they're useful for prediction, but we shouldn't just read off a metaphysical result from them. And every scientific theory has limitations, and you have to be careful how you interpret it. Now, that's true. That's well enough. But Craig only says that when it suits him. When it doesn't suit him, he's like, oh, well, there's lots of different scientific models about the universe, and they could be true, they might not be true. So it clearly means that the universe is necessary. No, Craig, that means that those aspects of the universe, as far as you know, are contingent. That is, they could be one way, they could be the other way. That doesn't mean that the existence of the totality of physical reality itself is contingent. Again, it's fundamentally the same fallacy, that just because parts of it are contingent, that doesn't mean the whole thing is contingent, or aspects of it are contingent. Also, Craig confuses epistemic, he does this elsewhere as well when it's convenient. Craig here is confusing epistemic possibility from metaphysical possibility. So a good illustration of the distinction here is the digits of pi, which everyone acknowledges are logically necessary. There's only one set of, rendered obviously in base 10, only one set of digits that pi can possibly have. That they're not contingent. They couldn't have been any other way, right? But we don't know what they all are. Pi is an irrational number, so it has an infinite number of decimal places, and we've only calculated a finite number. I don't know what the latest number is. But so there's plenty of digits of pi whose value we don't know. So as far as we know, they could be anything. 0, 1, 2, 3, up to 9, right? We don't know what the digits are until we compute them. But that doesn't mean that they're contingent. It just means we don't know what they are. Likewise, just because we don't know whether, say, string theory is true, or whatever else, vacuum fluctuation models of the Big Bang, whatever else have you, just because we don't know if they're true or not, that doesn't mean that they're actually metaphysically possible or metaphysically impossible. In other words, metaphysical contingency is different from epistemic possibility. And Craig knows this, he's written about this, and he mentions it when it suits him. But then when it doesn't suit him, he just sort of forgets about it and conflates the two, as he's doing here. So this is a very bad argument. First of all, science doesn't tell us about these metaphysical questions of could the totality of the universe have existed or not? Is it contingent? That's not a scientific question. It may not ever be scientifically answerable, in which case we probably should just stop asking it. But so the scientific theories he's talking about have no bearing on it. And then even aside from that, the fact that we don't know which theory is true, and you can't refute them by saying that one or other is metaphysically impossible or something, but that doesn't actually mean that they just because we don't know whether something is true doesn't mean that it could actually be either way. Epistemic ignorance doesn't entail metaphysical possibility. As I just illustrated with the example of the digits of pi, they're metaphysically necessary, but just epistemically unknown, so they could go either way as far as we know. But that just doesn't answer the question of whether it's actually metaphysically possible. So it's a complete red herring.
Philosophically speaking, I would say it's very plausible that a different collection of fundamental particles, say quarks, could have existed instead of the quarks that do exist. But in that case, the universe exists contingently.
Well, that just doesn't make any sense at all. Let me finish though before I.
Well, your desk. If your desk, which is made of wood, were made of ice instead, it wouldn't be the same desk. It would be an ice desk, the same size and shape as your wooden desk, but it would not be your wooden desk. So similarly, if the universe were composed of a different collection of quarks, as seems perfectly plausible, the universe must be contingent.
That's a great.
So I think there's a bit of sleight of hand here. So what Craig is saying is that, and I have read this argument before, he's saying that if the fundamental particles that make up the universe were different, then it would be a different universe, and therefore its existence would be contingent. Now, I think that that's playing on how we define universe, because that's arguably, I mean, first of all, it depends on how you assess the identity how you assess identity across possible worlds, which is a sort of a complicated issue. Because, yeah, like if you say that in order to be the same universe in different possible worlds, it needs to have all of the same properties, then anything that's different in the two universes would make it a different universe. And so that sort of isn't very useful. It means that you don't actually have any possible changes that exist. Normally what you would say is you would say that there's some properties that are essential properties, and those can't change across possible worlds. If it does, then it's something different. And then there are some properties which are non-essential, which can change. So, like, for example, normally people think of location as a non-essential property. Something can change its location and it retains its identity. So you can move it around and it's still the same thing. But maybe if you change what it's made of, for example, then maybe it's no longer the same thing, to take that example. I'm a bit suspicious of all this sort of argumentation, by the way, but I'm just trying to illustrate the idea. So if you think that, so if you understand it that way, then if you change the things that the universe is made of, then it becomes a different universe, and then so its existence is contingent, right? If it could be made of quarks or schmarks, right, and it happens to be made of quarks instead of schmarks, then in those possible worlds in which it's made of schmarks, it's a different universe, and so the universe is contingent. That would be the argument. Of course, the problem with that is that that's supposing that what defines the essential properties of the universe is the identity of its fundamental particles. And there's no real reason to think that. Again, we shouldn't conflate the universe as we understand it through science, like the observable universe with its physical properties and fundamental particles and so forth, with universe as understood here, which is the totality of all physical existence. Maybe non-physical existence as well, but certainly physical existence. And again, our universe could be a small pocket of that. A way to think about this is that like there's some sort of multiverse, which far transcends our ability to investigate it. It spawns off different universes. Maybe spawns isn't even the right word because that implies time, but never mind. And lots of different universes have different physical constants and maybe even different laws of nature and different types of particles in them. So any specific universe existence is contingent, right? But the whole thing, the multiverse, may be necessary. So it always exists. It's just that the individual universes that it spawns off are contingent. That's essentially just like saying that maybe our physical universe is necessary, but an individual galaxy's existence is like contingent, right? You sort of see the idea. Individual parts of it might be contingent, but the whole thing could be necessary. And Craig is just sort of defining this possibility away by identifying the essential properties of our universe as just like the fundamental particles that are that make up the physical matter in the universe. Like it's not even clear that that's very coherent either, because the fundamental particles, like for fermions that he's talking about, quarks, for example, they don't constitute the universe. Like the universe existed before those even existed. So yeah, the more that I think about it, that doesn't even make sense in his own narrow framework, because like when the universe first existed, there were no quarks, but presumably he would say that was still the same universe. So I guess maybe he would say, well, yeah, but the fields that gave rise to quarks still existed, that they just hadn't that the energies were so high that they hadn't sort of separated off like you probably had. Well, anyway, I won't go through the physics. It gets too complicated. So I guess he could say that, but that then gets you into a lot of issues about what you understand the relationship between the universe and the fundamental particles that make it up. I think it would be, yeah, it gets messy pretty quick. Sorry, I'm just thinking through some of these issues here. But Craig has given no reason to think that we should identify the essential properties of the universe with the types of fundamental particles that are in it. And at least on the face of it, it seems that that's not very plausible, because that's not what we mean by universe. I mean the totality of all that exists. So there could be lots of different things that could exist, but yet the totality is necessary. And the other thing is that, yeah, I mean, the universe pre-existed quarks, so why would you take that as an essential property? So again, a lot of sleight of hand here. It sort of seems plausible if you don't think about it too much, but then when you do, it doesn't really make any sense at all.
And I think in many ways leads us naturally to the second argument, which you cited as your top argument for the existence of God, if forced to pick one. And it's no surprise.
Yeah, cosmos might be good. So I would use cosmos to talk about sort of the observable universe that descends from the Big Bang, and then we could talk about universe as all that is. Although maybe you would have said it the other way. So that's the problem. It's sort of unclear. Anyway.
You might interrupt. I like to keep the argument separate because then you have independent lines of probability that are added together and increase the probability of the overall case. But in fact, the second argument that we're going to talk about in a minute is, I think, a coup de grace against the...
Greg, just because the arguments are linguistically separate doesn't mean that they're probabilistically separate, because a lot of the arguments have rely on premises or intuitions which are not independent of each other or even the same fundamental thing. So that's sort of silly to say that because there's multiple arguments that enhances the probability. That's only true if they're independent of each other. And I mean, as I argue about this in my book, like a lot of Craig's arguments are dependent on some pretty much the same set of fundamental intuitions or principles. And in fact, each argument, in addition, also introduces more specific things that he has to assume. So it actually, I think, does very little having multiple arguments to enhance the composite plausibility, because he has to add more to his own account, which then renders it less plausible. Yeah, someone being annoying in chat doesn't sound too bad.
A claim that the universe exists necessarily because it shows that the universe had a beginning. And if the universe had a beginning and came into being, then it is clearly not a necessarily existing object.
Perfect. That's such a helpful clarification. So why don't you walk us through basically...
Sorry, I was distracted. What did he say?
Grass against the claim that the universe exists necessarily because it shows that the universe had a beginning. And if the universe had a beginning and came into being, then it is clearly not a necessarily existing object.
It's not obvious to me that it necessarily exists. Oh, I guess what he... No, it's really not obvious to me. Well, okay, so the way that Craig understands beginning, I guess, because Craig understands beginning as something beginning to exist as meaning that it comes into being from non-being, essentially. And I guess if you understand it that way, then it would follow. If you understand it in the way that I understand it, which is under a different philosophy of time, then that's not true. To say that something begins just means it's finitely extended in time. So like it goes this far in time, forward in time, and this far backward in time, and it's just extended that way. But it could still be necessary, meaning that it exists in all possible worlds. It just maybe has different temporal extensions in different possible worlds, for instance. But I guess the way that Craig understands it, then it must always exist in order to exist in all possible worlds, because there'd be a possible world that was just our slice, like an early time slice, I suppose. But anyway, this is not the main point. The main point is that we don't know that the universe, this is the same, it's the same conflation again. We don't know that the universe began to exist. We know that our observable universe traces back to the Big Bang, but we don't know if anything happened before that in some other multiverse or high dimensional whatever. Like, we don't know. As far as we know, there could be many more parts of reality that we just don't have access to. And that's important for Craig's argument, because the whole point of the argument is that the universe as a whole, like all of physical reality, must have an explanation, not just our bit of it. Our bit of it could be contingent, but the whole thing being necessary, right? That's what the critic of this argument could potentially contend, and I think that's what people like Oppie have argued. And just saying that our bit of the universe, our corner of the cosmos, so to speak, has a temporal beginning, doesn't say anything about whether the universe as a totality has a beginning or came into being.
Perfect. That's such a helpful clarification. So why don't you walk us through basically what is the cosmological argument? And then I've got 2 or 3 of what are some of the most prominent objections I want to get your response to.
All right. As I formulated this argument, it goes as follows. Premise 1, whatever begins to exist has a cause. Premise 2,
so this is the Kalam
universe began to exist. 3, therefore, the universe has a cause. And then you do a conceptual analysis of what it is to be a cause of the universe. And a number of striking, theologically significant properties can be recovered by such an analysis. It turns out that there must exist an absolutely first, uncaused, beginningless, changeless, immaterial, timeless, spaceless, enormously powerful, personal creator of the universe, which is the core concept of God.
Yeah, so I do a detailed analysis of all of those properties in my book, and it turns out that most of them apply just by fiat. Like, essentially, Craig's argument for why the cause has to be personal, the cause of the universe has to be personal, it's just because, like, he can't think of any other examples of non-personal entities that could cause it, which is such a stupid argument. Like, okay, so let's suppose that no one could come up with any other candidates. We're talking about the fundamental cause of the origin of all physical reality, which is beyond the reach of science, why would we think that we can just come up with it? Like, maybe we should just say, maybe it's a type of cause we don't know about. But also, it's not even true, because people have postulated other types of causes. I mentioned a number of them, like Brahman and the Tao from Indian and Chinese philosophy, respectively. Now, those are... Brahman is sometimes translated as God, but it definitely doesn't have the same properties as the Abrahamic religion's conception of God. And the Tao, likewise, is not personal, but it's not purely physical either. Or you could postulate something like the Force from Star Wars. Essentially, you can come up with anything that has whatever properties you like, as long as it's not the same thing as the monotheistic God. Then you can postulate that as a cause for the origin of the universe. And Craig just doesn't address this at all. So it's just a completely facile argument. It's like, well, it has to be personal. Then the reason he says it has to be personal is because he says he can't come up with any other candidates. The other reason he says it has to be personal is because a personal cause is the only thing that has the right type of causal powers to get something out of nothing, essentially. And the reason he argues for that is just because he defines agent causation as having the special source that is exactly the power you need in order to generate this effect, like to bring something out of nothing, effectively. Like, you can't make this up. Like, literally, he defines an agent cause as having just the right causal power to do the thing that he needs in order for this argument to work. And then he says, oh, look, I found the thing that I need to bring about the universe, and nothing else will do the trick. Well, that's just because he's defined an agent cause in that way. He just asserts that it has that power. I won't go through all the details because it gets quite complicated, but have a look at my book if you don't believe me. Like, this is his argument. He just defines it as having that power without any reason to think that. He just says, well, that's just how it is, right? It has this special power, and nothing else will work. So it must be an agent. It's ridiculously silly. And that's if we accept everything else, right? All of the other aspects of the argument. This is just, why should the cause, suppose there is a cause of the universe, why should that cause be personal? It's really just by definitional fiat that he just says it is. And it's similar to many of the other properties as well. Like, it's that it has to be spaceless, for example. Like, well, it's sort of not obvious that you couldn't have a cause that existed within space. He just sort of says, well, anything that exists in space that we know of also is time bound, so it can't be that. Well, again, not a very convincing argument, because we don't know if there are versions of space that is not true, for example. Anyway, I won't rehash all of that here.
From two premises alone, which is why it is one of my favorite to use.
because that's because it's not from two premises alone. I document all of the additional assumptions that he has to make in order to get these results out of it. It's not two premises. He's just not telling you all the other premises, like about philosophy of time, for example, and the nature of space and time, and how you interpret relativity theory, and what you have to assume about agent causation, that you have to assume about, like, all of these other potential non-physical but non-theistic causes that he just waves away as non-possibilities, and a bunch of other things that I can't even remember. You check out the book. Like, he has to assume so much. That's why the Kalam is a terrible argument, because he has to make so many assumptions for it to work. But he just doesn't talk about them. He just pretends that you don't have to make them. So that's why it's remarkable. It's because it's not true. Like, it's fake. Craig has to assume so much in order to get the Kalam to work. It's actually a terrible argument for this reason. It's so complicated. It's like a Rube Goldberg machine of all of the different assumptions he has to make to get the whole thing to stand up.
In conversation with people. But one of the most common objections that comes up, you've obviously heard about this and dealt with this, is that quantum physics, in which there seems to be weird, uncaused things, can maybe explain the universe without a cause, or a universe from nothing.
This is just false, Sean. It's based on a misunderstanding. In quantum physics, the vacuum is not nothing. Rather, it is a roiling sea of energy, constantly fluctuating. And so in these models, the universe does not emerge from nothing. It has a physical basis in, for example, the quantum vacuum.
And this undercuts Craig's entire argument, because given this, we don't know if the universe had a beginning, right? Or we don't know if, specifically, we don't know if the universe came into existence from nothing, which is what Craig says. What we can say is that the universe expanded from this very, very dense, tiny state, 13.8 billion years ago. But we don't know what, if anything, existed before that. And you can't call it nothing, because we know that there was some sort of quantum state that existed, and we don't know how stable that was, or whether there was time associated with that. We don't have the relevant theories to develop this. There are different models, which Craig discusses, and his critiques of them are not convincing. I document some of this in my book. it probably needs a bit of an update because there's some new ones that I've discussed elsewhere. But the point is, this response that the quantum vacuum is not nothing, even like empty space-time is not nothing, undermines Craig's argument, because we don't have any reason to think that nothing ever existed in the way that he talks about it, like that there was ever a state of nothingness. Craig is just assuming that in order to say that the universe began to exist, like that there was nothing, like there was a state of total non-being, and then the universe came into being. But we don't actually know that at all. And he's admitting it here by saying that the quantum vacuum is not nothing. Well, yeah, there was a time when there was like the universe was tiny and there was no like matter in it. It still had energy. But that doesn't mean that that's nothing. Well, okay, yeah. So we don't know that the universe came into being from nothing. That's just an assumption.
Bill, every time there's a worship song and the line says nothing is greater than you or nothing is greater than God, I always think of the argument, because you say nothing is not something that's greater than God. It means not anything is greater than God. Yeah, exactly. And the same kind of confusion is taking place here. Quantum physics, it's not in a realm of nothing in the way that we mean not anything. And so you're in my mind when we sing.
Yes, and you can't establish that there was that not anything is ever a state that was relevant. But it's just pure assumption that the universe came into being from non-being. We don't know that. Oops.
That worship song, I'm like, yep, I'm thinking of a cosmological argument. All right, so here's a second one that I think is maybe a little tougher to deal with. You had a debate.
I just want to comment here that the format of this is really annoying. The format is Craig presents the argument as a series of premises. He makes no effort to defend the argument, and then he responds to some criticisms. Now, it's fine to respond to criticisms of an argument, but you should at least defend the argument first. Otherwise, you get this sort of weird dynamic where it feels like you don't even have to defend the argument, and it's up to the critic to defeat the argument. And that's consistent with what Craig has said before, like even in this discussion, about, remember, the principle of sufficient reason. Somehow he doesn't have to defend it, but the critic has to say why it's wrong. And he does this throughout his work as well. He just always shifts the burden of proof. When it's not convenient for him to defend something, he just says, well, you haven't shown that it's wrong, so therefore I win by default. He doesn't say that last bit, but that's clear implication. And so it's just weird. Like, why doesn't Craig have to actually explain why the argument, why we should believe the premises? I know he can't go into full detail, but like, what's the point of just saying the premises? You could just say anything, like at least give us some reasons for thinking that they're true. And then maybe respond to some objections. But like just going straight to the objections, I just find a bit strange.
With Sean Carroll, outspoken atheist, and he asked this question. I'm hoping you can respond. He said, now, how in the world can the author of the Borde-Guth-Vilenkin theorem say the universe is probably eternal?
Our listeners need to understand that this has to do with a...
What's that? See, this is such a stupid objection, because what does the Borde-Guth-Vilenkin theorem have to do with anything? Craig hasn't mentioned it. This is only relevant as an objection to a specific argument that Craig makes, which he hasn't made. It's like we're presenting an objection to an argument that Craig hasn't even made. Like, so why are we doing this? I'm not even sure that I want to cover this because it's quite technical. Probably should.
That Carroll pulled in the debate of showing a photograph of Alan Guth, one of the authors of the Borde-Guth-Vilenkin theorem, holding up a little sign saying the universe is probably past eternal. And the real question is not the one Carroll asks. The real question is, how in the world could Vilenkin say that the theorem shows that the universe probably had a beginning, and yet Guth says quite the opposite, that it probably did not have a beginning? Well, I found out later that there's a backstory to this puzzle. A few years later, when I had a debate with the British philosopher Daniel Kalam at Trinity College in Dublin, Kalam had seen the video of my debate with Carroll, and so had written to Alan Guth, asking him, what did you mean by that little sign that the universe is probably past eternal? And lo and behold, Guth wrote back to Daniel Kalam explaining that he was talking about Sean Carroll's own model of the universe, the Carroll-Chen model, which features a reversal of time's arrow at some point in the past. And I actually read the correspondence from Guth that Kalam had received. And in the debate,
I'm sorry, this is just so irrelevant. It just has no bearing on the argument.
So much in this debate.
Well, it strengthens the conclusion of the Hawking-Penrose singularity theorems that the universe cannot be past eternal. The universe can be infinite toward the future, but it cannot be infinite toward the past. At some point in the finite past, you reach a boundary point before which time cannot be extended.
So that, of course, strongly supports the idea that the universe had a beginning.
No, oh my God, this conflation is so frustrating. And on Craig's part, at least, it's just blatantly dishonest. Look, have a look at my book if you're interested in this. I don't want to go into all of this now because it takes a long time to explain. When it suits him, Craig says that the results of especially general relativity, should be interpreted instrumentally. meaning that, yeah, they're useful for predicting, but they don't necessarily tell us about the way the universe, like particularly space and time, really is. Now, that means that the Borde-Guth-Vilenkin theorem, which is entirely a result from general relativity, has absolutely no bearing on whether the universe began to exist, according to Craig, right? Because he says that you shouldn't interpret general relativity realistically, like it really describes the way that time really is. Because Craig believes that he's a presentist, and presentism is completely inconsistent with general relativity. General relativity, if you may recall, treats space and time as bound up together in four-dimensional space-time, and it treats when you like literally, if you read the paper, and I explain this in my book, in order to derive the theorem, Borde-Guth-Vilenkin, they integrate over time, essentially like summing up all of these times as if they exist, that they sort of integrate over trajectories and show that they're all finite. But according to Craig, that just has no bearing on anything, because time is not like that. Time is the coming into being and going out of existence of coming into and going out of existence. It's not like a spatial dimension that you can integrate over. It's completely inconsistent with Craig's philosophy of time. He says that you should treat it instrumentally, which means the Borde-Guth-Vilenkin theorem cannot be used to substantiate anything that Craig wants to say about whether the universe had a beginning. And even aside from that, it only applies to our universe, the universe that traces back to the Big Bang. It doesn't apply to the whole of totality of physical existence, because we could be part of a multiverse, right? There's a massive conflation here of the different senses of the word universe. For Craig's argument, like the Kalam, is talking about the totality of physical existence, not just like the bubble of space-time that expanded from the Big Bang. That's the thing that must trace back to a finite point in the past, according to the Borde-Guth-Vilenkin theorem, not the totality of all being. Physics can't tell us anything about that, at least for the moment, and maybe not ever. And Craig knows this, but he's just being dishonest. He just uses these results to convince people that science is on his side, when in fact science is not on his side here, very explicitly, because it's inconsistent with his philosophy of time. And when it suits him, he just throws out science and says, we should interpret it instrumentally. But then he appeals to the same science when it suits him. It's unbelievably dishonest. If you don't believe me or want more details, look at my book on the chapter of the cosmological argument. I go through this very clearly and explain it with quotes from Craig as well as other scholars about how this is the case. It's one thing I'd really like to ask Craig about in person, because I just don't think there's any way around this. That Craig can't appeal to the Borde-Guth-Vilenkin theorem and also maintain his position about philosophy of time, which he says that the Kalam is dependent on. And it's just completely inconsistent. And as far as I know, he's never addressed this.
The second premise. Okay. Yeah. This one I heard recently from Alex O'Connor, and I listened to it a few times, so I hope I'm representing it as accurately as I can. He suggests that the Kalam cosmological argument may be circular, and he says that this
I just don't care about this.
Mathematics.
So one of the
I'm just going to skip this.
It should be preferred.
That's a great response. So I want to make sure that people listening are grasping this, because this can be one of the harder arguments for people to follow.
What's he talking about?
Maybe not quite as hard as the ontological argument, which we will get to.
Oh, I forgot about the ontological argument.
Not the fact that most people, we live our lives assuming that math applies to the natural world.
Hang on.
Of that applicability and their physical
phenomena I missed this side of this argument.
To cry out, on the basis of abstract mathematics.
That all of us have to stop at some point with something that can't be explained for explanation, let alone points to God.
I would respond that it's really with the physical world. Rather,
I want to get to the math argument.
Seems dependent to follow. Maybe not quite as hard as the ontological argument, which we will get to. But if we start from not the fact that most people, we live our lives assuming that math applies to the natural world. We live in such a science-dominated culture. But if we start from the perspective of worldview, a theist should not be surprised that there's a connection between the two of them, because God is rational. He made the world orderly. And of course, on a Christian count, called us to understand. And
what does orderliness have to do with mathematics, Sean? Can you explain this to me? Because mathematics also applies to chaotic systems, to random systems. So can you explain to me what mathematics has to do with order? And I would also like an example of a universe that was not describable by mathematics, because mathematics, as far as I know, can describe pretty much anything that's logically coherent. Now, not always as usefully, not as always as predictively. Some systems are inherently unpredictable, right? But our universe is very unpredictable. I talk about this in the book, that it's actually really hard to, it's really actually hard to predict anything in our universe, especially with any precision. Like even the most let me give an example. So if you studied physics, even at like high school level, you might have studied the Schrodinger equation and how you can actually solve that for a single electron atom. solve it mathematically, meaning that you can mathematically describe the probability that the electron will be in any particular location around the nucleus. I mean, it's quite a complicated function, but you can produce an exact solution. And that's pretty cool, right? That the universe is describable in that way. That only works if you have one electron. You add just a single other electron, there is no closed form solution. You can't write one. And if you're interested, I have a podcast called the Science of Everything podcast. There's a 2-episode series there about computational chemistry where I explain how it is that we use various approximations to try to describe the probability of even a simple 2-electron atom. Like, what's the probability of the electrons being in different locations? The reason is because they interact with each other, they repel each other, and so it becomes very complicated. It's excruciatingly hard to get a result out even in that simple case, let alone like many electrons and multiple atoms. This is just an example from the basic equations that govern, the formation of atoms and molecules and so forth, or their electronic properties. Not to mention all of the other aspects of life that are just so hard to study, to model, to predict. So the point is, almost any type of universe would be describable mathematically. Some would have more predictive capacity and easier solutions. Some would have less predictive capacity and harder solutions. Figures give us no explanation whatever of what we should expect, where we should be on that spectrum. How predictable should it be? How simple, how complicated the rules should be? There's no guidance at all. It seems pretty much anything other than total formlessness, I suppose, would be consistent with God's like rational nature or something like that. I mean, they don't even explain what rational or orderly means here. Because again, like what would be a counterexample of a universe that would not be consistent with this, other than like maybe nothing at all? But then like, is that they usually say that God chose to create, which means that it would have been possible for him to create nothing. So that wouldn't have been inconsistent with his nature. I don't know. The whole thing is a dog's breakfast. Like, they just appeal to this vague idea that God is logical and orderly and whatever. And as if somehow mathematics just falls out of that. But these people have no idea what they're talking about when they talk about mathematics, or how applicable it is, or what that has to do with God's mind.
And subdue the earth. But if you start with a naturalistic worldview, that's where the surprise comes in. Is that a fair summation?
Yes, absolutely. I had a wonderful dialogue with Sir Roger Penrose in London a few years ago, where Penrose says there are 3 domains, as it were, of reality.
Yeah, that's just what he thinks. No one, you can't establish that.
The domain of mathematics and abstract objects, and then the physical domain. And he said the puzzle is, how do you put these 3 together? He had no answer.
But Craig, you don't even agree with that, because Craig is a nominalist. He doesn't believe in a Platonic realm of numbers and sets and whatever. And it's not like people haven't talked about this. It's just Penrose has some weird ideas, just because he doesn't know how to put them together. I'm not going to go through a whole philosophy of math here. I am writing about this in my book. This is the problem with responding to Craig. I just get agitated. He just mystery mongers. It's like, oh, there's maths, and like, just how can you explain it? Look, mathematics is an abstract way of describing patterns, essentially. Like, you look it up in Wikipedia, it's like number, form, quantity, space, things like this. We abstractly and rigorously describe them. That's really all it is. I give an example in the book of queuing theory, which is a way that we can describe the probability of like how wait times in a queue, essentially. That's something we can describe mathematically. But do we think that like God designed queues? I mean, queues are just something that happens when you have a system where some entities enter and they stay there for some time, and then some entities leave. Like, they're very simple dynamics that make a queue, and then you can study the statistical properties of that. That's very interesting, right? But like, no one needs to design anything. All you need is a very simple set of processes happening, or even abstractly. Like, it doesn't, you can just think about it. But for the real world, we see those things and we form a set of abstractions to describe them. You don't need anyone to design this, other than humans like thinking about it and writing it down. Now you could say, right, that God made a universe and that universe could be described mathematically. But the idea that like it had to be designed in order for it to be described mathematically is the part that doesn't make any sense. Because what type of universe couldn't be described mathematically? Mathematics is just a rigorous, abstract description of different things in the world, right? Like space, form, number, and probability, and so forth. So there's no mystery here, right? Like, the abstractions that we use in mathematics are derived from the physical world. This is called the mode of abstraction, right? Where we pick aspects of the world and like abstract them and then form processes to describe them. And then those become more and more complicated. You build abstraction on abstraction on abstraction. Like, you start with the idea of a number, 1, 2, 3, and then you come up with addition, and then multiplication, which is iterated addition, and then like exponentiation, which is iterated multiplication, and logarithms, and then you introduce like negative numbers and imaginary numbers and you calculus, and like we just build abstraction on abstraction. And many of these things have no relation at all to anything specific in the physical world, though they can be, some things can be used to describe aspects of the world. Some things have no application at all that's known about. We just sort of study them because people find it interesting. There's no mystery. Like, what's the big mystery? Sure, there's specific questions to address, but like, Craig doesn't really explain what the big mystery is. It's like, oh, Roger Penrose doesn't know how these things relate to each other. Well, partly that's because he's a Platonist, and then you have this like abstract realm that somehow has some bearing on the physical world. Well, just don't be a Platonist. And by the way, Craig agrees with me on that because he's not a Platonist either. So if you're a nominalist, there's just no real problem here. I don't see what the big mystery is.
How you can have a unified worldview incorporating these three domains. And I said to him, theism is the answer. There is an ultimate transcendent mind who grasps the truths of mathematics and logic in his own intellect, and who has created the physical world on the model that he had in mind. And Penrose said, I've never thought of that before. Wow. After the show was over, he thanked me for sharing that alternative with him, because it was a new thought to him.
That is amazing.
And then everyone clapped.
Amazing to me on a few levels. Number one, that he hadn't thought about that. Somebody so brilliant and influential and has clarity on these issues and what needs to be solved. In some ways, that's quite revealing. And last thing I'll point out is I want to make sure people understand that your argument works here, whether you take a realist or a non-realist, a fictionalist view of mathematics, there's still agreement that science works, so to speak, and rely.
Well, no, I mean, yes, that part, but what Craig was just talking about, the three domains, there isn't a separate domain if you're a nominalist, or like a fictionalist is a version of nominalism about mathematics. You don't think there's a separate domain of sets and mathematical objects, right? You think that there's different ways of describing it, but essentially that they're ways that we describe things, ways that we talk about things, not some separate existence that we grasp. The way that Craig even said it then, like God grasps the truth, kind of implies that there's this separate realm. And certainly the way Penrose described it, there is a separate realm, because Penrose is some kind of Platonist. Craig is not. So he doesn't think that when God grasps mathematical truths, that God is grasping some sort of separate domain that exists and outside the physical realm. So the argument doesn't really apply. Now, it's true that, people think that maths is applicable regardless of whether you're a nominalist or a Platonist, whether you think that there are these mathematical objects that are abstract out there somewhere, or whether you don't think that. But it's really, particularly as a nominalist, like, it's sort of problematic either way, I should say, because Platonism is a problem for Craig under theism, because it implies that there's this domain that's outside of God, and mathematical truths are supposed to be necessary. And so Craig thinks there's a problem with explaining how those could exist separately from God. So that's why Craig is not a Platonist, right? I know there are other theists who disagree with that, but that's what Craig thinks. But then it's kind of a problem under nominalism as well, because then it's just not really clear what the issue is. Like, mathematics is not this sort of thing that just sits outside the physical world. It's just our way of talking about the physical world, or like aspects of the physical world in an abstract way. So why would it be surprising that it's relevant, that parts of mathematics, certainly not all parts of mathematics, are applicable to the physical world? I'm totally unable to see why this is surprising. Like, we construct a formalism partly in order to describe the physical world. Certainly initially that's why mathematics was developed. And then we're shocked that it describes the physical world. And even then it describes some things, but like, it's not, you certainly can't use maths to describe everything in the physical world. Or at least we haven't figured out how to do that yet. So like, what's the big mystery here? They just never explain it. It's these silly anecdotes about, oh, I talked to Roger Penrose and he was baffled by this, and like, no one can understand it. No, there's no clear problem.
Upon this mathematical connection, so it cries out for this explanation, regardless of whether you think numbers are real or not.
Right.
Penrose didn't know that you could just save magic.
Okay, so let's move on. We are halfway there. We have 3 arguments down, 3 to go. The argument from fine-tuning.
This argument can be very simply formulated. Number one, the fine-tuning of the universe can be explained by either physical necessity, chance, or design. Premise 2, the fine-tuning is not explained by physical necessity or chance. 3, therefore, it is due to design.
Bill, sometimes people will formulate this. I think I've heard Dembski formulate that it's chance, necessity, or third, a combination of the two, and it's not any of those 3. Why wouldn't you include that? Or do you feel like the response to the
This just has he defined what he means by fine tuning here? We're just expecting that people know that. But if people already know what fine tuning is, why do they need this argument? This isn't like he's just spat out the premises. We're given no reason to think that fine tuning is real or that these premises are true. Now, in my book, I explain why I think that fine tuning is not established. That the idea that the constants of nature, the physical constants that govern how our universe operates, are such that if they were changed even slightly, complex embodied life would not be possible. That's the claim of fine-tuning. And I'm a bit like many atheist philosophers will acknowledge fine-tuning, but then have different explanations for it, such as that it's necessary or some sort of chance explanation, usually appealing to a multiverse there. But I just really think they're wrong about this. Like fine-tuning, I'm not saying that we know there is no fine-tuning in this defined in this way. But my claim is that we actually have no reason to think that there is such fine-tuning. And I've developed this a little bit more since the book. Like I've expanded on these points in some debates that I've had, which you can look up on my channel. But basically the problem is that we don't have really any clear idea of what the necessary or sufficient conditions are for a universe to be hospitable to some type of embodied life. The way that physicists have assessed this is that they have determined that the type of life that we have in our universe, carbon-based life, would not be possible. And even like atoms would not be stable and things like that. If the constants, if many of the constants were even a little bit different. But that is actually not relevant for theists because theism doesn't predict that you would have carbon-based life. The theism at best, and this is debatable, but at best, theism predicts that you would have some type of embodied life. In which case, we need to assess what's the probability that a universe would have some type would allow for the existence of some type of embodied life, not our specific life, but any type of embodied life. And we simply don't know that because we have no idea what would be possible. And I make this very clear that if you just look at the fundamental equations that govern our universe, there is a 0% chance that you would just be able to derive our existence from them. Like if you were just, with our current knowledge, if you were just starting from the equations, like we can't solve the equations in anything but the absolute simplest cases. And so I have absolutely no faith that we have the ability to determine what types of complex embodied life would or would not be possible in wildly different universes that we don't know anything about other than just like by changing the numbers in our equations. So I don't accept that the universe is fine-tuned. There is other structural problems with the argument as well, such that, for example, it takes the equations, the Lagrangian of the standard model specifically, as well as general relativity, it takes those as given, but then asks about, well, what if the constants were different? But it doesn't really make any sense to do that. The constants and the equations together constitute a theory that describes the universe. It's really just arbitrary and completely unmotivated to take one as fixed and then take the other as potentially variable. And I don't know of any justification for this other than, well, we just don't know what to do if the equations are different, but we can at least hypothesize about what might happen if the constants were different. And so this is just really arbitrary. And then there's further questions as well about like, well, why would you expect a God to fine-tune a universe as opposed to all the other things he could do? I've got a good video on this, if I do say so myself, if you're interested in that aspect of the fine-tuning argument. But it looks like that Craig's not even really going to talk about trying to defend fine-tuning. We're just going to take it as
sufficient,
given.
and that extra premise is included in the argument itself.
Yes, that's my intention, Sean, is that to combine chance and necessity is not to offer a new explanation or account. It's just saying that those two things account for the...
Yeah, that's exactly what I was saying. It assumes that the equations we have, like the physical laws, are necessary, which is just as false as assuming that the or let me rephrase that. Maybe they're necessary, but that's just as strong an assumption as assuming that the constants are necessary. But they want the laws to be fixed, but the constants to be like potentially variable, which is just doesn't make any sense as a combination, in my opinion.
Tuning of the universe, and yet neither of them does, either individually or even in concert.
The fine-tune argument was one of the top ones cited by the 100 apologists that I interviewed. And I've also heard a lot of skeptics, even people like Christopher Hitchens, citing the fine-tuning argument as giving him some pause if there had to be some argument that pointed towards the existence of God.
Yeah, because the fine-tuning argument appeals to physics that most people don't understand. But when you understand the physics, you realize that the physicists have no idea what they're talking about. Yes, they can tell us that life in our universe, like with our laws and constants, would not be possible. Even atoms would not be stable and stars wouldn't be able to form and so forth. Sure. But what does that have to do with anything that theism has to say about it? Theism doesn't have anything to say about whether God would create life in our universe. At best, and this is even debatable, but at best it says that God wants to create embodied life of some form. Okay, well, what percentage of possible universes, varying the constants, can have some form of life in them that is embodied? No one has a clue, because no one knows what the conditions are for the existence of some form of embodied life, and you can't just read that off a Lagrangian. All they do is look for like atoms, or whether stars can be stable and things like that, or how long the universe is going to last before things pull apart with like the great rip with dark energy and so forth. But we don't know what the time frame is. It's not like that God is on a clock and a universe can only last for a certain amount of time, or has to last for a certain amount of time. There could be life that lasts for nanoseconds or billions of years for all we know. Like, we just don't know. And it's pure speculation if anyone's going to say, oh, no, there can't be any sort of embodied life here in a universe that has totally alien combinations of constants. I just am thoroughly underwhelmed by this argument and the arrogance of certain physicists, including like non-theist ones, who just claim to know what exists in these in hypothetical universes with combinations of parameters that we know nothing about, when they would not even be able to tell us what would exist in our universe if they just had the equations to start with. We only know that they give rise to embodied life because we know a bunch of things about how the universe works above the very basic level. But if you just started from there, like, you wouldn't be able to simulate all these things. It's way too complicated. We can't even really describe even simple atoms, like for example, describing how the nucleus forms using the strong from the strong force is incredibly difficult. So like, what other types of states might be possible with very different combinations of constants? Like, we just don't know. And it's just a vibes based argument. Like, well, it just feels unlikely that there's any combinations. It just seems like, we can't really imagine what they would be, so we just think that there aren't any. I don't really see why this is thought of as so
two big objections.
Convincing.
One of them, atheist Dan Barker has suggested that we
But yeah, the point is, I think a lot of people just don't know how weak the argument is, and they just sort of take the physicists at their word. But you got to look at exactly what they say, what they show in the papers. Yes, our form of life is highly contingent on the parameters being a certain way, but that's not relevant for the theists. The theists need to say something about any type of embodied life, unless they want to tell us that their version of theism predicts that we would have like carbon-based life on rocky worlds going around main sequence stars, right? In which case that would be very convincing as an argument, but like, there's just no credible argument for that as to why you would expect this particular form of life as opposed to any other form.
Have the fine-tuning argument backwards. So rather than the universe being fine-tuned for complex life,
yeah, I don't care about these objections.
Regularly and
they just pick such lame objections. Well, not all of these objections, but like obviously we're suited for this universe, but like, that doesn't mean that the universe, it would be possible for any form of life to exist. But that's the whole question. Like, we don't actually know. But anyway, I have better objections. Craig should talk to me. That's my that's my position.
Universes will appear somewhere in the collection by chance alone.
Oh, here, there's a
only
multiverse
such
one.
Universes could be observed by us. The fallacy lies in thinking that only finely tuned universes are observable. In fact, it appears that
this
it
is the
far
Boltzmann
more
brain
probable
thing.
that most observable universes in the multiverse would be universes populated by.
I was too friendly to Aiken in our debate. I seem more critical in my reaction videos. Of course, I'm more critical when I'm not talking to them face to face. That's it. That's entirely natural. I'm not going to have exactly the same demeanor. But I think if you watch that debate, I was quite critical of him at times. It was also a structured debate. I'm not just talking to the microphone, so I can only talk at certain times. I don't know. I tried to be polite, but I was also quite critical. I pushed back at a number of times and sometimes interrupted him because I think that he was misconstruing what I said. So, there's different, I don't know. One can argue about the exact right tone to take in different contexts. I think I was fairly critical while it's being professional and polite. Obviously, I'm a bit more emphatic here because I'm just on my own channel by myself, just talking. So it's not quite the same format. But to each his own about exactly what tone you think is appropriate. Thanks very much, Dov Rob. We didn't find you, but would you be willing to discuss with prominent skeptics like Graham Oppy, Alex O'Connor, who I think aren't with you? Yeah, Oppy actually mentioned this about my book, or at least he mentioned it to me. So Graham Oppy has endorsed my book. You can find a little blurb of his on Amazon. He did say, though, that he is happy to accept fine-tuning as like a fact, a scientific fact. I don't recall him giving any reasons for that. I think he just accepts what the science say about this, and I think that may be because he's not very familiar with the specifics. He may have other reasons, but yeah, I mean, I know that there are a lot of people who accept it. I just think they're wrong about this. It's there's a specific sense in which fine-tuning is established, but as I've said, it's not the sense that the theists need it to be for their argument to work. That just is not established. And people who say it is, they're just full of hot air as far as I'm concerned. It's all vibes based as to why we should think that the narrow form of fine-tuning, our form of life being fine-tuned, it can be extrapolated to any type of life fine-tuned. Anyway, but yes, good point there. But I'm happy to talk to anyone about these sorts of things. I have an open invitation if anyone wants to challenge me. As long as they have something substantive to say, send me a message. We'll organize things. I've already had a few people on my channel who've taken me up on that. So very happy to, or if anyone has connections, let me know. I have interacted with Oppie a bit, but I haven't had him on my channel before, though I wouldn't be particularly interested in talking with him about fine-tuning because I think there's more interesting things to talk about him specifically about. But anyway, so Craig here is then saying that even universes that weren't fine-tuned for life could still be observable. So let's see where he goes with this.
Most observable universes in the multiverse would be universes populated by freak observers called Boltzmann brains.
Yep.
These
Boltzmann
are
brain
brains
injection.
that fluctuate into existence out of the vacuum with illusory perceptions of an external world. And therefore, if you adopt the multiverse hypothesis to explain fine-tuning, you have to believe that you are all that exists and that everything else around you is an illusion, which...
Okay, so Craig is, as usual, overstating things. The idea is that in many of these multiverse scenarios, these Boltzmann brains, these brains that just fluctuate into existence and hallucinate all of their beliefs about the world and then disappear after a certain amount of time, vastly outnumber conventional observers like you and me, right? Or what we take ourselves to be. And so it's not that you would have to think this. It's just that with very high probability, we would be Boltzmann brains rather than genuine observers. And if you think this is implausible, then you would have to reject that explanation. That's the idea. Now, of course, this is a bit circular because you could just say, well, maybe we are Boltzmann brains. Like this is essentially a version of the brain in the vat scenario, right? Like, well, maybe we are just fluctuations in the cosmos and hallucinate ourselves into existence. Like hallucinate the rest of the universe into existence, I mean. Now, I don't think that. I'm not going to advocate for that. But you could say this if you wanted to. I don't know of anyone who's defended that, but it is sort of a little bit question begging to just like claim that that's impossible or completely unreasonable. More to the point, though, this Boltzmann brain scenario, which sounds bizarre, but like physicists have sort of looked at this and talked about it as like a genuine possibility. I can't remember how much detail I go into in the book. I think I mentioned it, but I've delved into it a bit more since then as well. This argument that Craig is giving is entirely contingent on the relative number of Boltzmann brain observers versus conventional observers. Like, observers actually made of physical matter that evolved on a planet, blah, 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 as opposed to just fluctuated into being and then disappears after a while. This objection only applies if there's way more Boltzmann brain observers than conventional observers. How does Craig know that there will be way more Boltzmann brain observers than conventional observers? I mean, surely it depends on the specifics of the scenario, right? Amongst other things. And the answer is that he cites certain papers where people have argued that this would be the case, that there would be way more Boltzmann brain observers than conventional observers. Now, shockingly, there are other papers where people have modeled it differently and they come to the opposite conclusion. In my view, we have no idea what proportion of observers will be Boltzmann observers versus conventional observers. It depends on the specifics of the scenario. So really all you need to do is come up with a scenario in which conventional observers are more common in that multiverse compared to Boltzmann brain was, and then this problem goes away. And people have come up with those scenarios. Of course, there are problems with those scenarios. But you see, this is what Craig does. Whenever someone postulates some sort of speculative multiverse scenario, he'll say, oh, but there's this problem and there's that problem and there's these technical issues and people don't agree about it. Well, sure, Craig, that's because they're actually doing science, or at least a speculative form of science. They're playing within some constraints, at least, about like what types of laws are appealed to and entropy and other things like that. They're not just coming up with whatever they like, just by arbitrarily postulating God has this power and God can operate in this way with respect to time. And he has this way of bringing being from non-being and all of these other things that if you read my book or even just Craig's work, that God just says that Craig just says that God does this or just has this property. because there's no constraints on Craig. He can just say whatever, as long as I guess he can come up with some way to reconcile it with his understanding of the Bible, then anything goes. There's no constraints. Whereas when you're actually trying to come up with a physical theory, even if it's not one that can be directly tested, you still have to play within certain restrictions. You can't just say, and then a miracle occurs, or it's magic, or, you know, equivalent of that. So yeah, there'll always be, until we can test these particular problems with any given theory, but that doesn't mean that they are less likely than Craig's scenario that is just sort of invented with no real constraints on what is allowed or how to assess what's probable. And so this is always what he does when anyone postulates an alternative that's based in any way on science, even if it's still speculative science. He just points out specific problems with it, which you can always do with any scientific theory, right? And you can never do with any theist theory in the same way, because they just come up with whatever they like, and there's no agreed upon methods for assessing them, other than maybe whether they fit with the Bible, but you can just make up whatever you like there as well. So like, I just have very little respect for this type of philosophizing, where Craig can just invent whatever he likes, whatever appeals to divine powers or intentions that he likes to, in order to get the conclusion that he needs. Like, why would God fine tune a physical universe? There's no real reason given for that, but he could, so good enough for an explanation. But if that's good enough for the theist, then the anti-theist or the skeptic or whatever can just postulate that there's a multiverse that has the right properties such that it doesn't have too many Boltzmann brains. Like, I could just postulate that that's the case. But Craig would say, well, that's ad hoc. Well, how is that more ad hoc than what Craig does, where he just postulates that God wanted to make exactly this type of universe? Like, again, you see, it's an inconsistent standard. Anything that Craig does, and this is something that Oppie appeals to actually, and Malpass as well has talked about this. Anything that the theist does, the atheist can come up with a version that essentially does the same thing, that accounts for the same phenomenon by just making slightly different postulates. And in general, there's not going to be any way to distinguish between those two in terms of probability. And this is one of the reasons why Craig's arguments are so weak. It's because he comes up with some dilemma that's often of his own creation, like the applicability of mathematics, or how the universe came into being, or how the universe is fine-tuned. He comes up with some problem and then just throws God in, plugs God into the hole to resolve the issue, like to answer the problem. But you can plug in anything you like if you can just make arbitrary postulates about properties or powers or whatever else. Like, God just says, Craig just says that God has a reason to make a universe like ours. It doesn't really give reasons for this. People like Swinburne have tried to defend it, but like, they just invent as many arbitrary postulates as well about like God's intentions and purposes and whatever reasons he has for doing things in a certain way. So if that's fine for Craig, then the skeptic can just come up with whatever they like as well. Yeah, okay, there's a multiverse. Each spawns off many different universes. They all different constants, but there's constraints that mean that there's that the number of conventional observers is overall much larger than any number of Boltzmann brain observers. Easy, done. Problems solved. And Craig will complain, Bobby, you just that's just ad hoc. You just sort of made that up. Yeah, I'm just learning from Craig. I'm just doing the same thing. Now, I'm not saying we should do metaphysics this way. I'm just saying that this is how it works if you apply the same rules to both cases. It's just that Craig is able to come across better in many of these debates, especially when he's talking to scientists, because they often try to play by better rules. They try to constrain themselves, at least with like reasoning that's motivated by physical principles that we understand, like things like entropy, or defining a Lagrangian to come up with the equations that govern your universe, or working within the framework of general relativity, for example, or extensions thereof, like things like this that give constraints on what they're allowed to postulate and how they're allowed to come up with things. And Craig doesn't have to operate under those. He doesn't even need to be consistent. He can just say, on one hand, the Borde-Guth-Vilenkin supports the idea that the universe began to exist. And then on the other hand, when it's inconvenient, just say, oh, it should be interpreted instrumentally. And he does that many times for different scientific theories or philosophical principles. So like, this is why Craig is able to get the better of these sorts of cases, because there's no real constraints on what he does. But many of the people that he argues with have constraints on how they operate, usually because they think scientifically in some way, or they appeal to science. And there's limits to what we can know. And then there's certain things that are very well established that you generally won't want to rule out. And so that gives constraints that then make certain types of argument difficult. But really, if you play fair, the atheist or skeptic can just come up with a non-theistic version of whatever it is. And this is a good example of this. I can just get around the brain problem just by saying, well, look, the multiverse just has such properties that we don't have many Boltzmann brains. Problem solved. And if Craig comes up with something else, then I'll just postulate another principle that makes that problem go away. Because that's exactly what Craig is doing. You have to postulate so many things in order to explain why God would create a specific universe like this of all the other things he could create. But Craig never talks about this. And unfortunately, part of the reason is because a lot of skeptics don't press on these things. They take the theist explanation as given and then try to defend a skeptic or a non-theistic explanation or why we don't have an explanation. But this is something I've increasingly become to realize. You actually just have to press just as hard on the theistic explanation because they're so bad. They're terrible. They're just all ad hoc hypotheses or postulates. Why would God fine-tune a universe like ours exactly? Like, why would God create anything? If he does create something, why would he create life? Why would he create embodied life? And why would he create this type of embodied life? Why would he create embodied life that runs according to natural laws, like physical laws? All of these things can be challenged and really are quite suspect. And I've talked about these in some other videos as well. And that's what I think is really important as counter-apologists. We need to push on these things because we can't just let them have their explanations go unchallenged. Because if we try to answer some of these issues about like where the universe came from or why it appears fine-tuned, and we're operating under certain constraints like epistemic and scientific constraints, and Craig and others aren't, then to many audiences, they will seem to get the better of us because they won't notice the tricks that are being used, and it will just seem like that they can answer questions that we can't or are problematic for us. Well, that's because the playing field is not level because one side is operating under constraints, the other is not. And so we've got to call out as how bad their explanations are precisely because there's no constraints on what they can say. They just come up with whatever they like. So I think this is super important. I think the fine-tuning argument really illustrates this really well because people just sort of accept that fine-tuning, like theistic fine-tuning, God explains it, when it explains nothing at all and is an unimaginably poor explanation. Anyway, I've gone on for long enough about this. Question. I'm not sure if you have made this exact argument, but if theists have made a leap when saying God wants to create life, don't they need to say God wants to make... Oh, yeah, exactly. Yes, I just said that. Because God could create non-physical life. So why does he need physical life? God could create physical life, but which is not, I talked about this. I don't think I talk about this in my book maybe, but I've talked about it in more recent videos. God could create a type of life that's physical, but does not require the laws of physics to be any particular way. How is that possible? Well, he's God, right? He could do miracles. He could do whatever he wants. As long as it's not logically inconsistent, you can have some sort of emergence where life's existence is not contingent on any particular underlying physical principles, even if those principles are operative. Like the assumption of the fine-tuning argument is you can only have physical life if there are particles that can interact in the right ways to build up to give rise to life. But the theist doesn't even accept this. At least like Christians don't accept this generally because they think that God can do miracles. He can bring a body back to like Christians believe that Jesus had a physical body, but that physical body was resurrected through a non-physical laws, like they're not typical physical laws, not the Lagrangian physics and the Lagrangian that defines the standard model of physics, which is relevant to the fine-tuning argument, right? So God could just do that, like just for everyone all the time, or some variant thereof. Like, so what exactly is it's unbelievably illogical to, on the one hand, say that God can do miracles and bring people back from the dead and do other things that intervene in the natural world, such that the laws of physics as we understand them and as the fine-tuning argument is established on those don't apply. But then at the same time, when we're trying to say why the universe appears fine-tuned for life, say that, well, God made it that way because, of course, you know, he wanted to make life and he couldn't make life in any other way, right? Well, but obviously he could because you believe that he could. So from top to bottom, the fine-tuning argument is a comedy of errors. Like there's nothing that makes any sense about it. Even if you accept fine-tuning, the theistic explanation is terrible, and there's no really good reason to accept fine-tuning. And the objections to like the multiverse are just based on inconsistent standards that Craig's has, because he can appeal to whatever he likes, but then the skeptic is not able to do the same thing. God would love Boltzmann brains; they would never wear mixed fabrics. Yeah, why wouldn't God create a universe of Boltzmann brains? What's the problem there? Like, there's just absolutely no logic for any of this.
No sane person believes.
This is, correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I think the response you're giving here is a reductio ad absurdum that says, okay,
we could never be certain of anything that we perceive with our senses around us, because it is more probable that we are one of these Boltzmann brains than a normal observer.
Yeah,
but the reason that leads to skepticism differences in perception
here, but we're coming back Tuesday.
By the way, as good empiricists, we should never be certain about anything that we perceive. Always be skeptical. Not like global skeptics, but like always be somewhat skeptical at least.
If you have those further objections, write your objections in, and I would bring a Talbot professor of philosophy with me, and we'll do our best to respond. All right, so let's move to the fifth argument, the moral argument.
Oh, the moral argument.
A very simple version of the moral argument. There are many versions. Mine goes like this. Premise one, if God does not exist.
This is a good point. The unlevel playing field where apologists can do unrestrained fan fiction while atheists have to stay within the constraints of known science is because theism was the dogma in the past. Yeah, I think that's essentially correct. And we're still sort of living within that framework of giving too much, taking too much for granted about theistic presuppositions, like not challenging exactly how it all fits together or why you should make certain assumptions. And even I think atheists often do this. And I talk a bit about this in my book, but I've become even more aware of it since I wrote my book. So it's something that I try to bring up as often as I can. Just as an example, someone mentioned before my debate with Jimmy Akin about the resurrection. I pressed him for like an hour and a half to give me any reason at all for why we should think that God would raise Jesus from the dead. And I even explicitly said, look, let's assume that God exists and let's assume that he does miracles. Because they say, oh, you only don't believe it because you don't believe in miracles, which is obviously wrong because most Jews and Muslims and most Hindus don't believe in the resurrection, at least not in the way that Christians do. And many of them believe in miracles, so that's obviously wrong. But anyway, I explicitly said this, and he just refused to answer the question. It just dodges, and then he critiques my argument, and then he talks about like Hume and miracles and presuppositions and parapsychology. You know, you can watch the video for yourselves. I put it up on my channel, but like he just didn't have anything to say about like why would we expect God to raise Jesus from the dead? What's the explanation there? Why is that plausible? What renders it a good explanation? I asked him like 5 or 6 times in different ways, and he just had nothing to say. And this is what you see, that apologists don't actually like to defend their arguments. Sort of see that very clearly here. They state their arguments, and then they just critique anyone who either says something differently or tries to refute them. They don't actually defend their arguments. They're just relying on you to think that the argument is plausible or to already accept the conclusion, or at least be responsive to the conclusion, like to think it's plausible even if you're not fully convinced, because they can't actually defend it in any depth because, you know, they don't actually have any theory. Like there is no theory. It's just because they said so.
Then objective moral values and duties do not exist.
Sorry, I'll just jump back a bit.
The moral argument.
I've defended a very simple version of the moral argument. There are many versions. Mine goes like this. Premise one, if God does not exist, then objective moral values and duties do not exist. 2, but objective moral values and duties do exist, from which it follows logically. 3, therefore, God exists.
I know we don't have time to totally go into detail here, but that second premise is where I find students pushing back and challenging this sometimes. In fact, in my class here, teach class here at Biola, and we talk about the moral argument, and the students are like, we agree with you, we're with you, but role play with us so we can think about this. They're like, how do we really know that morality is objective? How do we prove or how do we demonstrate this? Maybe give us one key way you would support that second premise.
I think that 98% or more of people really do believe in objective moral values and duties, Sean.
So that is an empirical claim, Craig. So it'd be nice if you presented some empirical evidence for that. I don't know a great deal about the empirical work here. From what I understand, it really just depends on how you ask the question. I mean, some people are very clear they believe in absolute and objective moral values, and some people are very clear that they don't. A lot of people have a mixture of intuitions in the middle, and it just really depends on how you frame the question. Because people aren't philosophers and they don't, you know, use the same vocabulary, so you can't just ask them like, "Are you a moral realist?" Because, you know, they won't know what you're talking about, and you can get different answers depending on how you ask the question. Yeah, exactly. Lance Bush. I was trying to remember his name. Yeah, Lance Bush has done some work on this, and I believe that he's talked about this issue. So this idea that 95% of people are moral realists, like, what's that based on, Craig? If you just pulled that out of nothing, it's like God pulled the universe out of nothing. If you're going to claim that, like, cite some evidence. Don't just say stuff. But also, it doesn't really matter if 95% of people believe it, because that doesn't make it true. Maybe that means we should take it more seriously, although I'm not sure if it does. It maybe depends on the issue, because like most people could be creationists, but that wouldn't really make a be good reason to be a creationist, for example. Most people were. In some countries, 95+%. I think creationism is very popular in the Islamic world. There are surveys of this. But anyway, the point is, A, it's probably not true that 95% of people are moral realists or believe in objective morality. And B, even if it were, it's really unclear how that's relevant. It just sounds convincing when he says it in this way, or at least to a certain type of person it's convincing.
And if they give lip service to moral relativism or nihilism.
Sorry, there was a donation here. I don't know what this is, but thanks very much. I'd like to hear what you think of my above argument. Wait, what's the above argument? I don't agree because I think a transcendent God would probably be very mysterious to us. I think the best theist arguments are trying to rule out blind materialism, not claim they know everything about God. Maybe Christians aren't the best theists. Well, it could be true that a transcendent God would be very mysterious to us, but then the problem is you can't appeal to such a God in order to explain why the universe exists or why it's fine-tuned, because you can't say, well, we would expect such a God to make a universe that looks in so and so a way, and therefore it's consistent with that expectation that we actually observe the universe that way. Like you can't make that appeal if God is so mysterious and unknowable. You have to know quite a bit about God in order to make that argument. So I'm open to this idea of a fundamentally mysterious God, but I just think you can't use these arguments then. Like take the resurrection argument. You can't say God is so mysterious and unknowable and then also say, oh, but he would resurrect this particular guy for these very specific theological reasons. Well, you seem to know quite a lot about God and his reasons and how he operates if you're going to make that argument. So either you have this mysterious God that's unknowable, in which case maybe I can't refute it as a naturalist, although there's still, I think, things that can be said about it, like the plausibility of an immaterial mind. I think we can say some things about that, given what we know from science. But many of the objections that I make about the unknowability of God are sort of a feature rather than a bug if you think that God is unknowable. But then you can't run these arguments because these arguments rely on us knowing a bunch of things about God and what he would do. So that's the issue. Like either you think God is mysterious, in which case maybe you can't refute that, but you can't really run these arguments, or you run these arguments and then God isn't really maybe mysterious in some ways, but at least in a bunch of very specific ways, you seem to know a lot about what he would be likely to do and what his properties are. Craig just listed out a whole bunch of properties that he thinks God, you can infer that God has just in virtue of the fact that the universe began to exist. So like he doesn't think that the God is mysterious in that way. And so there's a tension there between trying to hold those two things at once. And I think that that's precisely the problem there. Anyway, good question.
The best way to help people to see this is just to ask questions. So, for example, I was approached after one university talk by a black student who said, I don't think that there are objective moral values. And I said, really? So you think that racial discrimination is not wrong? And he was kind of...
Oh, there we go. See, again, Craig has not really published much on academically about the moral argument, unless he's started to in the last few years. But last I checked, he hadn't. He mostly writes and appeals to popular audiences, which is fine in and of itself. But the thing is, he's either ignorant or being deliberately misleading. And I suspect it's the latter because he's a smart guy and he should know about this. So people who don't believe in objective moral values or who are non-realists, in the vast majority of the cases, would not affirm that like racism is okay. Or let me get exactly how he phrased it.
A black student who said, I don't think that there are objective moral values.
Yeah. Okay. So this person has affirmed that they don't think that there are objective moral values. So that would mean that they're not a moral realist. They don't think moral values are true objectively, meaning mind independently. Okay. And Craig says,
really? So you think that racial discrimination is not wrong?
Right. So Craig says it follows from that, or Craig is sort of implying to them, it follows from that they don't believe that racial discrimination is wrong. That is a non sequitur, Craig, because the vast majority of people who don't believe in objective moral values still believe in moral values. They just don't believe that they're objective in the way that Craig thinks they are. Now, I say this as a moral realist myself, although Craig and I would differ about the basis of moral values and exactly what it needs for them to be objective. But the slippage here is that Craig is inferring that because someone doesn't believe in objective moral values, that therefore they don't believe in any moral values. And that's just not true. I mean, some people don't believe in any moral values, but most people who are not moral realists who don't believe in objective moral values believe in some kind of subjective moral values, or they may be a non-cognitivist, which means that they don't think moral values are about truth or falsity. They're about like expressing our displeasure at certain things, or giving people orders about what to do. And there's various hybrid views you can have as well. The point is, Craig is just being, I think, willfully ignorant here because it suits him. He's saying, oh, so you don't think that it's wrong, like racism is wrong? Well, no, they didn't say that. They said that they don't think it's objectively wrong, or meaning in some mind-independent way, in some sort of maybe transcendent way, or outside of humanity kind of way, or independently of anyone's perspective kind of way. But that doesn't mean that it's not wrong in some other type of way, Craig. It's like, it's very simple if you just look at what non-cognitivists or moral relativists or any sort of non-realist says about what they think about morality. There are only a small number of people who will actively say, like, yeah, like nothing is right or wrong in any sense. That's a very fringe view, and it's not implied by not being a moral, not believing in objective moral values. Yeah, here's a good way to put this. If you say that pizza is not objectively tasty, that doesn't mean that you don't think that pizza is tasty. You just don't think it's objectively tasty. Like, it's dependent on your perspective. And many people think this about morality as well, or not even your own perspective, but maybe it's a cultural relativism. So it depends on your society. Maybe you even think it's relative to like humanity as a whole. So it's like a sort of a species relativism, but not in a transcendent way. I think that's sort of what I think. And I think that that's close enough to objectivity because it's not dependent on any particular person's mental state or cultural norms. But anyway, we could debate the fine details about exactly what that means. But Craig's not going to have any of that. He's just going to say, oh, well, you don't think it's objective? Well, so you don't believe in it at all. How silly. Like, just apply this to anything else. Like, is language objective? Well, it's objective in the sense that you can't just make it up yourself. You know, words have meanings and they have ways you pronounce them and a grammar and so forth that any individual doesn't invent and can't just change arbitrarily. I mean, you can say whatever you like, but like people won't understand it. It won't be correct linguistic practice, right? But it's, unless you think languages are all given from God, like languages aren't objective in any sort of transcendent sense. You might say they're intersubjective. Same thing with money. Money's a really good example here. Like, oh, people say this sometimes, like, oh, money's just fake. It's just all like whatever everyone thinks it's worth. But yeah, but like that doesn't make it fake. That just means that it's based on social customs. Like, it's still very real and has very real effects. And you can't just decide that it doesn't have real effects or that money isn't worth what it is. But that doesn't mean it's like objectively real. Again, depends how you define objective. I would say it's objectively real, but I don't think the way Craig's using the word objective, it seems that you need more than that. It's got to be somehow outside of people. Well, if we mean outside of people, then language and money and arguably morality too are all like not objective in those sense, but that doesn't mean they're not real. So yeah, there's a debate to be had here about what we mean by objective, and that's part of the issue because there's often not a lot of clarity there. But again, Craig's not actually interested in having a serious discussion about that or talking with people about what makes something right or wrong, which I think is a more interesting question than is it objective or not? What makes that true? And instead, he's just going to play this silly language game like, oh, so you don't think it's objective, so you must not think it's real at all. Normative entanglement. That's interesting. I haven't heard that phrase. The conflation of normative ethics and meta-ethics. That's another good way to put it. Yes. So even people who have various types of non-realist meta-ethics will still make normative claims, and they just understand them differently. So that's it's a very it's sort of like a rookie error. Like, it's just a very trivial mistake to make, which is why I don't think it's a mistake. I just think it's a deliberate strategy that Craig uses, because it superficially is like, that does seem a problem, that I'm simultaneously saying that I think something is wrong, but also that I don't think things are absolutely wrong. You just need to learn a little bit about normative theory and meta-ethics to understand that they're just different questions and that there's no inconsistency there. I mean, it's still good to think about these things, of course. There's a discussion to be had, but Craig is not trying to have a discussion. Craig is just trying to bully people into sort of accepting what he has to say, or at least into presenting what they think as if it's not supported, when in fact he hasn't given any argument for that and is making a very basic conflation here. Am I moving towards moral non-realism? No, I don't think so. I just think I'm thinking more about exactly how we should understand the distinction between realism and non-realism. And I think that a lot of it is actually terminological. Because I think that some people think that in order for something to be a moral realist, you have to believe in some kind of transcendent morality. I don't think morality is transcendent, but I think it's real and it's not dependent on any particular person's opinions about it. So in that sense, I'm a moral realist. But anyway, we can talk more about that another time. The point is there's a lot of views on the table, and most of them don't imply you having to reject all normative ethics, as Craig is implying here.
And he was kind of set back on his feet, and he says, well, I guess I do. In that case, he does believe in objective moral values. So use illustrations like religious persecution.
They're objective, and you've got to unpack what you mean by objective. Like, this is just so basic. And I know Craig knows this. So, like, is Craig an idiot about, like, does he not know anything about normative ethics and meta-ethics? Or is he being deliberately like manipulative or misleading here? I mean, I guess he could have a third view where he, like, look, you could say that if it's not, you could have you could have a non-standard view, and you could say, look, if you don't believe in objective moral values defined in so-and-so a way, then you can't use any normative language at all. Like, it's just inconsistent. But then he has to defend that view, which is certainly a non-standard view, because most people would say that your meta-ethics and your normative ethics are pretty separate from each other. And that just because you're not a moral realist doesn't mean you can't have normative, you can't endorse normative claims. You can't, you just understand them in a different way. That's very much a standard view. You can reject it, but you're going to need an argument for that, Craig. So unless he's going to be willing to defend that, and I don't recall having seen him do that, he didn't even make an argument here. He just says what he's doing to defend his position is relating a story about how he asked a student a question, and they're like, oh, they had some realization. That's not an argument. What's the argument? Why should we think that we need God? Well, specifically, we're saying, why should we think that morality is objective? We should think that it's objective because we have normative views. Well, if you think about it for 4 seconds, that's not actually a very good reason. It just means we understand the nature of those views differently. So why should we understand them the way Craig does? He hasn't given us any reasons. And then what does God have to do with that? Well, maybe we'll hear in a moment.
The Crusades. If the religious right were to round up all the homosexuals and put them in concentration camps, do you really think that's morally neutral? And if the
student didn't say that it was morally neutral, they just said that they don't think morality is objective. Now, what they meant by that, well, you could have a discussion. Maybe if you were actually interested in their perspective, you could ask what they mean when they say it's not objective. That would be interesting, right? Could unpack that. But instead, now we're just going to foist all of these beliefs on them that they didn't actually say.
Honest with you, not just putting up a smokescreen. As I say, over 98% of people will say, yes, we do believe in objective moral values and duties. After all, this generation of students, though they've been taught to give lip service to relativism, are deeply committed to values like inclusivity, open-mindedness, diversity, equity, and so forth. And so they really do believe in the objectivity of moral values and duties.
That's my experience as well, is that some of the live and let live and tolerance of maybe the 90s is gone. And we have a very judgmental generation willing to shame somebody who does something
I don't know
wrong,
if there's any evidence that that's really changed. But interestingly, there is a phenomenon called, what has it been called? Undergrad relativism or something, where like new students who are new to philosophy are more likely to be relativists than their professors. I don't know if this has actually been studied, but it's an interesting observation that people have made. So I don't know if this is a new phenomenon. Anyway, doesn't really matter.
Find yourself judging something as being moral. Remind yourself you don't actually think that's wrong. And so in many ways, you're appealing to this deep intuition and knowledge that we have. Okay, so here's a response.
By the way, just a point about this. So a lot of people who are moral realists will appeal to these intuitions and say, well, isn't it just obvious that morality is objective? I think this is a terrible argument for moral realism. The reason I'm a moral realist is because I think that that we can articulate plausible theories about what morality is and what it amounts to that are not mind dependent and also do not require us to make any implausible postulates, like invoke God or karma or some other some sort of abstract moral values or something. And so that's why I believe in it. Like, I just think it's a good explanatory theory that doesn't require implausible postulates. It's not, obviously you have some intuitions that will affect your reasoning, but like it's not a direct appeal to intuition. I don't really believe in settling philosophical disputes by that. At most, I think intuition could be a starting point for inquiry, help shapes what we think about. But I think that that's a terrible argument, and I don't think it's a good reason to be a moral realist. Anyway.
And again, folks, there's a lot more responses than this. You can write them in. We'll come back live Tuesday and do our best to address them. But
also a good point. Not a representative sample.
And he offered, I thought, a fascinating atheistic account of objective morality that's called godless normative realism. Now, of course, people can go watch the whole debate and make up their own.
Is
Okay, I'm gonna
just.
skip this part.
I do not understand how these sorts of moral qualities can exist as abstract objects apart from persons. Secondly, the account.
Yeah, so he's sort of critiquing Platonism. I mean, I kind of agree. I don't believe that justice is an abstract object. I think that it's an abstraction, which is a different thing, a way we describe aspects of the world at an abstract level. Justice is like the economy, right? It's an abstraction, but it's entirely instantiated in physical states of affairs. So there's just no real issue there. It's vague, sure, but like there's lots of vague things. It doesn't mean they're not real.
It gives no explanation of objective moral duties. It attempts to show that moral values are these abstract objects. But whence arises my obligation to conform my life to these values? Presumably on Platonism, there are also objective moral vices that exist, like sloth, avarice, jealousy, cruelty, and so forth. So why am I morally obliged to align my life with one set of these abstract objects rather than another?
I think the Platonist is going to say something like that it's part of the inherent nature of justice and the other virtues, such that they have that they are such that they call on us in some way to align our life with them. Like, I'm not a Platonist, right? I'm not going to defend that too much. But what I'm saying is that they're going to appeal to some sort of inherent property of the virtues with respect, in contrast to the vices. Now, again, notice that that's just the strategy that theists use. Because you ask Craig, why do we have an obligation to adhere our lives to the way that God says it should be? And he's just going to say, ultimately, it's part of God's nature. So why can't you just say it's part of the nature of the abstract objects? It's the exact same thing. Craig can just say whatever he likes. But whenever someone else comes up with a theory that requires postulates, he just challenges the postulates. It's so ad hoc.
The account has no answer. And then finally, the account cannot explain why the natural realm, governed by the laws of physics, and the moral correspond. It seems to me far more created the world in such a way
hang on.
of a natural and moral lawgiver who has created the world in such a way that these match each other.
I think all three of those are very fair.
Yeah, but why do we have an obligation to act in accordance with the way that the lawgiver has created the world? Craig ultimately appeals to, and I talk about this in my book, he appeals to the God's nature as being the ultimate ground of morality and normativity. I don't think that's much of an answer, and there's problems with that. But again, if he can do that, then the Platonist can just say, oh, well, it's the Platonic forms that do that. Or the naturalist can just say it's some aspect of human nature, or maybe human and animal nature that ultimately grounds moral status, like well-being or something. That's sort of what I think. Craig does address this in some articles, but he just sort of says he thinks Craig thinks his version is more plausible, but I don't think he really says why. So that would be an interesting discussion to have, is to actually flesh out which of those theories is simpler and more explanatory. But unfortunately with Craig, we almost never get this. He just demands that people have better and better defenses of their own views and justify every little thing, where he doesn't sort of feel any need to do that for his own views, or very little need.
Objections. The last one, how kind of the natural world lines up with the moral world. It's not only a problem for that view, but it's arguably a positive case for design, because for there to be this principle of justice that exists, and that we would evolve to the point without any mind or intention whatsoever, that we would grasp that, be capable of living that way, feel a duty to carry that out, seems far more probable that there's design behind it. I mean,
I actually think that is a reason to be skeptical of Platonism. How it is that we grasp the Platonic realm, particularly with under evolution. I don't think Platonists have a very good answer to this. I've read some answers and I don't find them convincing. But anyway, I'm not a Platonist, and neither is Craig, interestingly enough. So
then there is just some blind process. But of course, someone could write a doctoral dissertation and flesh that one out in a little bit more detail. All right, so the last one, the ontological argument. Before we jump in, Bill, I taught high school Bible for 21 years, full-time and part-time.
This is a very good point, actually. Platonic objects obviously can't do anything since they are spaceless and timeless. But God, on the other hand, oh, wait. Although Craig doesn't think that God is timeless. He thinks that God can exist in like timeless mode and temporal mode when he creates the universe and enters into time, which I think might be a view that Craig actually invented himself. Maybe not invented, but like he developed it. Because I think it's an unusual view from what I understand. But anyway, yeah, like certainly Craig thinks that God can act outside of time because he created the universe. So generally Platonists think that Platonic forms like abstract objects are causally effete, meaning that they can't do anything, they can't cause anything. Whereas God is supposed to be causally efficacious. So he can cause things. So in that sense, he's unlike He's spaceless and timeless, perhaps, but he also has causal powers. But again, like you can just say whatever you like. What's the constraints here? I could just come up with whatever entity that I like that just has the properties needed to do the thing that I needed to do. This is why I find this philosophy pointless, because you can just invent whatever you want.
Last few years, I would teach an honors Bible class with students. So these are juniors and seniors. And each year I did this, they wanted to spend more time on the ontological argument than any of the other arguments. And it fascinated me.
I just forgot about the ontological argument. It's so silly.
I only frame it that way, not because I don't think you're capable, because this is a difficult argument. Explain to us the heart of the ontological argument.
Let's see how he frames it here, because I've shown in my book that he frames it in an incredibly dishonest way. Let's see if he still does that here.
At the heart of the argument is the idea of a maximally great being. And a maximally great being is defined as a being which is necessarily existent, omnipotent, omniscient, and morally perfect. And the argument goes like this. 1, it's possible that a maximally great being exists. 2, if it's possible that a maximally great being exists, then a maximally great being exists in some possible world. 3, if a maximally great being exists in some possible world, then it exists in every possible world. 4, if a maximally great being exists in every possible world, then it exists in the actual world. 5, if a maximally great being exists in the actual world, then a maximally great being exists. 6, therefore, a maximally great being exists.
I think it's a brilliant argument. Now, maybe before we come to the objection, can you clarify what's meant by possibility? Because there's physical possibility, metaphysical possibility, logical possibility. When you say a maximally great being possibly exists, clarify what we mean by possibly exists, please.
That's crucial, Sean. We are talking here about metaphysical possibility, not merely epistemic possibility. Epistemic possibility.
Well, this is interesting because in some popular presentations of this argument, he conflates those two, which I give examples of this in my book and criticize him for that. But he's distinguishing them now, so that's good. Of course, how you establish that it's metaphysically possible that a maximally great being exists is entirely beyond me. And this is why philosophers maybe find this argument interesting from a technical point of view, but like no one finds it actually convincing, because it's just like, well, look, if you're a theist, you're going to think that a maximally great being is possible. And if you're not going to think it's possible. So like, what is the point of this argument? And I'm generally pretty skeptical about modal arguments in general, because I just don't think we have the sort of modal knowledge that's about possibility. Modality, it refers to like possibilities and what could or could be different. I don't think we have the sort of modal knowledge that a lot of philosophers think. I don't know. There's just these people who think that they can sit in their armchairs and work out the ways that things could or could not be different. I just don't understand how people, where they get the confidence. Where do people get that sort of confidence that they can just come up with these sorts of things? I just have no idea.
It means for all I know. And so you might say, well, for all I know, it's possible that God exists and it's possible that God does not exist. But that is not possible in a metaphysical sense. It's one or the other, not both. To illustrate, suppose you see a complex mathematical equation on the whiteboard and you want to know whether or not it's true. Well, you might say, well, it's possible that it's true, but it's possible that it's not true. Well, that's the case only in an epistemic sense. In a metaphysical or logical sense, that equation is either necessarily true or it's necessarily false. So similarly, when we say that it's possible.
Craig did not explain that very well. Do I want to get? You don't normally say an equation is true or false. I guess you would normally say the equation holds or it doesn't hold. I guess if you think of it as like an identity, then that would be true or false, or like a theorem can be true or false. Maybe that's what he meant, because an equation can hold on all depending on the value of the variables that you insert into it, right? But maybe he's talking about a theorem. Anyway, I'm just nitpicking here. I just don't think he explained that very clearly.
That a maximally great being exists. What we mean is it's metaphysically possible that there is such a being.
Okay, so this means we can move from the mere metaphysical possibility of God to the existence of God. And so the critic has to show that the metaphysical existence of God is impossible.
No, this is why. So this is how apologists think. I see this so often. It's unbelievable. This is how apologists think that the world works, right? They say something, like it could be anything. They come up with the most ridiculous nonsense. And as soon as they said it, the skeptic has to prove that it's false. Like they've just claimed that it's possible, that it's metaphysically possible that a maximally great being exists. They haven't given any reason at all. And now Sean's just saying, so the critic has to show that it's impossible. Like, no, you have to show that it's possible. You're making the argument, or I guess Craig is, but like, Well, I don't have to show anything. If you want people to take your argument seriously, you got to give them a reason for thinking that that's plausible, that the premise is probably true. Why do I have to say anything about it until you've at least given me some reason? I agree that there's some burden on me to respond if they give a lot of convincing reasons, but you just said a thing, and now Sean is saying that the critic has to show that it's impossible. They have to show no such thing.
Burden of proof that the critic would have to show, and is the only way to do that is to show that it's logically impossible, because if something's logically impossible, then by definition it would be metaphysically impossible. Explain what the critic has to do
it's metaphysically impossible, even if it's logically
well,
possible.
what the atheist has to say is not simply that God does not exist. He has to say that it's impossible that God exists, because the argument shows that if it's possible that God exists.
People have known this for a long time, though, that God is a necessary being. And so, like, if you don't believe, I don't think people have really ever thought, at least since coming up with like classical theism, that God is a being that could happen to exist or happen to not. Like, there's some worlds where there's a God and some possible worlds where there isn't one. That's been generally understood, that this modal logic formulation is just using modern formalisms to articulate this basic point. It's framed as if it's this great insight which puts the skeptic into a grave dilemma. It's not. Like, everyone already who's thought about this already knows that God is the sort of thing that either exists necessarily in all possible worlds or doesn't exist in any of them. That doesn't address anything at all. Like, we knew this. It doesn't answer because the exact same arguments are going to be given for whether God exists necessarily as that are going to be given for whether God does exist. So it just doesn't advance the debate at all. That's why no one's convinced by this argument. And this is sort of Obi's point, right? That the argument is so unconvincing that not a single person on the face of the planet has ever been convinced by the ontological argument in isolation. If you can find an example, I'd be very interested. But I don't know of any examples to the contrary of this. People have been convinced by other arguments, but the ontological argument never moves anyone because it's just so circular and unconvincing. It's so useless. I don't even understand why Craig... Because I don't think it's appealing to a popular audience. Like, I can understand the cosmological argument or the moral argument. They have this sort of appeal to a popular audience. I don't think the ontological argument does. I don't think even most people can understand this argument. So I just don't get why
he actually exists. Now, it is not correct to say that he has to show that the concept of God is...
Yes, and this is, I think, one argument that you can give to the contrary, that God doesn't appear to manifest the behaviors we'd expect from a maximally great being. Look at how lousy the universe is compared to how good it could be. And I think that that's actually, this is something I've been toying with. And I have to sort of formulate this more formally and see if anyone else has written about this. But basically, a common, well, maybe not a common, but a response to the problem of evil is essentially to say that no matter how good the universe is, like, okay, yeah, there's lots of bad things about the universe, but you could imagine it better, and then better than that, and better even than that. No matter how good the universe was, you could always imagine it being better. God could create more happy people or more harmonious animals or more states of joy or like whatever else, right? And that means there is no maximally great state of the universe that God could create. And so that means that you could always invoke this issue of like, well, the universe should be better than it is. And this is somehow used as an argument against the problem of evil, because it's like, well, no matter how good the universe was, you could always say it could be better. And so this is some sort of reductio against complaining about how bad the universe is. But I think this shows that at least for any finite universe is inconsistent with God as being a maximally great being, because presumably a maximally great being would create the maximal amount of good. So if there is no maximal amount of good, then how can there be a maximally great being? I think that that's an inconsistent belief set. I think there's potential ways out of this. Like, you could just say that God has instantiated the maximally best world, which includes a maximum amount of like goodness. But then why is it all this suffering? Like, surely that would imply that the universe couldn't be improved, which it seems obvious that it could be. Like, there's trivial changes you could make that would make the universe better. So it's not the maximally best universe, right? Like, you have to jump through some pretty implausible hoops to say that, well, yeah, but if I tried to do that, then something else would go wrong. So this actually is the best of all possible worlds. Anyway, I think that it's really hard for the theist to make sense of this. I think it's just better to say that there is no there is no best possible state of affairs. That there's always a better one that there could be, and therefore God is. If that's true, if there is no maximally best, morally best possible state of affairs, then I think that God is impossible. But anyway, that's a sort of a vague form of the argument. I don't know if someone's tried to develop this more formally.
logically incoherent, because there are metaphysical impossibilities that do not involve a logical contradiction. I gave one earlier in the podcast. My desk could have been made of ice. That's metaphysically impossible, but there's no strict logical contradiction in that. One of my favorite examples is given by Alvin.
That's only, by the way, that's only metaphysically impossible if you define the composition of the desk as being an essential property of the desk. And I actually disagree with that, because I don't think that that's what defines the sort of existence conditions for, say, material objects. But anyway, we could have a long debate about that. But I just think that that's a mistaken way to think about things. You need to think functionally, my friends, functionally.
Flanagan, he says the prime minister could have been a prime number. Well, there's no logical contradiction in that, but nevertheless, it's clearly metaphysically impossible. So
I think that's pretty clearly conceptually incoherent, if not strictly logically impossible. And other philosophers have written about this, that there's a sort of a subset of, there's a sort of impossibility, like it's the married bachelor, right? That's not actually logically impossible. It's just conceptually incoherent, or like a square circle. Well, a square circle maybe is logically impossible. Sort of depends how you define logic, right? But there is at least things that cannot be logically formalized that nevertheless seem to just not make any sense. And married bachelor or the prime minister being a prime number would be examples of that. I don't actually think that we need to invoke metaphysical necessity there. We can just talk about conceptual coherence. But anyway.
Atheist has to give, if he's to be justified, give some reason for thinking that it is impossible that God exists.
Okay, so Bill, I just want to make sure I understand. So if something is logically impossible, then by definition, it's also metaphysically impossible. But there can be things metaphysically impossible that aren't logically impossible, like my wooden desk is ice.
Correct.
Okay, so here's one of the...
Well, no, your wooden desk being made of ice, that's logically impossible, right? Well, I mean, at least conceptually impossible, because wood is not ice, right? Craig is actually making a different point, that his desk could not be made of ice, because, I mean, there could be a desk that was made of ice, but that wouldn't be his desk. It would be a different desk. I would actually say differently that I don't think that the material composition of an object is part of its essential properties, but, you know, that's a different issue. I think Sean actually misstated that, because a wooden desk logically cannot be an ice desk, but Craig's desk logically could be an ice desk, but it couldn't metaphysically be an ice desk, because then it would be a different. I mean, it gets very complicated. Is that modal aspects or issues are always so confusing.
Common objections that I'll hear is, I guess some people might call it the reverse ontological argument. Instead of saying it's possible that a maximally great being does exist, they'll say it's possible that a maximally great being does not exist. Why is that not convincing to you?
I just see no reason to think that this premise is...
Oh, I thought he was going to say it's possible that a maximally evil being exists. That's the more interesting version, like the anti-God version. But anyway, this is perfectly reasonable as well. Look, it's possible the other way. Let's see what Craig's response is.
Why is that not convincing to you?
I just see no reason to think that this premise is true. I think that we have much better reasons for thinking that it's possible that a maximally great being
exists,
Craig? Than that it's possible that a maximally great being does not exist. But I'm...
The point is, whatever reasons Craig is going to give, presumably it's his other arguments, right? In which case, the ontological argument isn't adding anything. This is why it's such a bad argument. It doesn't add anything to other arguments. You can only defend the premise that it's possible that a maximally great being exists if you have other reasons for thinking that a maximally great being exists. This is why it's a terrible argument. But notice also that I can just say I have no good reason for thinking that it's possible. And then one person says that they have no good reason for thinking it's possible. The other says there's no good reason for thinking that it's impossible. Well, what a pointless conversation, right? Like, it just doesn't get you anywhere.
Content to just leave the questioner. Pardon me, I'm content to just leave the question with my interlocutor. Just leave him with the question. What do you think?
It's not an argument then, Craig, if you just ask a question and leave it with the interlocutor. That's not an argument. You have to tell us. Remember what a good argument is supposed to be, that the premises are in conjunction more than 50% probable. Well, why should we think they're more than 50% probable? Craig hasn't even given us any reason. He just says, well, he thinks it is. Oh, okay, Craig. Well, if Craig thinks it is, I mean, like, he's given up even trying to give an argument at this point. He's just leaving it with the interlocutor.
Do you think it's possible that God exists? If you want to deny the existence of God, you have to think that it's impossible that God exists. So what do you think? Is it possible that God exists or
exactly? And this is where he is misleading, because he asks this question to the audience, right, without first distinguishing between between epistemic or a metaphysical possibility. And most people don't know that distinction, and they don't know that technically when Craig says, is it possible, he doesn't mean, like, as far as you know, could God exist? Like, is it imaginable that God could exist according, even, because your knowledge is limited, maybe he exists even though you don't think he does, right? No, when he says possible, he means asterisk metaphysically possible. And every atheist who understands this issue will say, well, no, I don't think it's metaphysically possible, but I could be wrong, in which case I would just be wrong about, some modal claim. It doesn't mean that I have to be certain that there is no God. It just means that an implication of my belief that there is no God is that it is metaphysically impossible that there is a God. And this is why Craig is so slimy about this, because to a popular audience, they don't understand this. And so when he just presents the argument, they're going to come away with the impression that in order to be an atheist, you have to be certain that there is no God, which is absolutely not true.
Impossible. And I think that puts, as Greg Kokel likes to say, a stone in his shoe to give him something to think about. And so
it doesn't give the atheist anything to think about if they've, as long as they understand the implications of their views, that overwhelmingly, this sort of God that Craig is talking about is understood to be a metaphysically necessary being. And so that if you think that there isn't one, then there necessarily isn't one. That's all that it is. It doesn't mean you have to be certain that there is no God. You can't admit of any possibility. Craig is just admitting here that he doesn't have any argument for the crucial premise there. I mean, I guess he has his other arguments, right? But he doesn't have anything new for the ontological argument. And he just uses it as this rhetorical device. He pretty much just said it there. He's content to just leave it as a stone in their shoe, just asking the question. But any atheist who knows really much of anything about this already knows this and is going to be completely unmoved. So Craig, how is this a good argument? You haven't even tried to establish that the premises are more likely than not.
Just doing that much.
That's really fair. Now, of course, there's
no, it's
many
not
more
fair. It's a joke.
And again, put them in here, folks, and we're going to come back Tuesday at 4:30 Pacific Standard Time and do our best to respond to some of these. But you picked 6 arguments. Why did you pick these 6 to include in the latest volume of your systematic philosophical?
Okay, so he didn't talk about intentionality. I think, oh yeah, and there was no Christological argument. I guess that's not technically an argument for God's existence, so he hasn't talked about that. I forgot about the ontological argument. I mentioned all of the others, and I forgot about it because it's just so dumb. Like, it's barely even an argument, especially the way that he phrased it. It's actually not an argument. I guess he stated the premises, but he didn't even try to defend the premises. And he even said that he doesn't bother to defend the premises. So it's like, okay, bro, like, you could just say anything now. So yeah, I don't remember the
theology
ontological argument most of the time.
Well, these are the 6 that I've worked on over the years, beginning with the Kalam cosmological.
Yeah, so there's nothing new here. These are the same arguments that he's been making. The only thing that I think is the only argument here that's like less than 20 years old or so is the applicability of mathematics, because he didn't used to argue that. But all of the others, like, he's been writing about for at least 30 something years. I don't know exactly how long. And not even that, like, it's fine to have the fundamental arguments to be similar, but everything he said here I've heard before. Absolutely nothing new. And you see this if you read Craig's works. Like, he self-plagiarizes a lot. Like, multiple of his books are just whole pages and paragraphs copied with maybe slight changes here and there, but without citing himself. And there's just a whole lot of repetition. And I'm not saying no one else does this, but like, it's, you know what you're going to get is what I'm saying. So I don't know. They've talked about the 6.
Argument,
what are we doing in the last 10
in my
minutes?
doctoral research at the University of Birmingham in England, and then most recently with the argument from the applicability of mathematics. So these are simply the ones that I have studied in considerable depth and find to be.
Okay, so Craig has studied the Kalam cosmological argument in considerable depth. That's certainly true. Fine-tuning to some extent. I have not seen any evidence that he studied the moral argument or the applicability of mathematics to any depth, because of what he's written about this is very superficial, and he's not really published on it, unless he's published something significantly new in the last few years, but I highly doubt that. So if he has, I'll admit that I'm wrong. But I guess the point is, I don't think he has studied most of these arguments in considerable depth. I think a few of them he has, but many of them he only seems to have engaged with them very superficially. Or at least that's what he's talked about. I guess you don't know what else he's studied, right? But in terms of how like, the moral argument is a classic one, where he just like doesn't even address this issue that you can have different, like, that your normative beliefs are not the same as your meta-ethical beliefs, for example. That denying that morality is objective doesn't mean that you can have no moral beliefs, for example. Or nor does he have much of anything to say about, like, why would we expect a universe to be mathematically describable more under, why would we expect that God would create a mathematically coherent universe more than a non-mathematically coherent one? And what would even an example of that be anyway? Like, there's just no engagement with that in any depth. Similarly with the with the what was the other one? Well, the ontological argument. We just saw there he didn't even present an argument, right? He just like asked it as a question. Incredibly superficial. Now he has written a lot and a lot of detail about Kalam, so that's certainly true. In some ways, it makes it worse rather than better because it's gotten so complicated and he has to appeal to so many premises that the argument becomes weaker and weaker. And he's written more as well about fine-tuning, although that has a similar problem. And he's written also quite a lot about the resurrection argument, but we haven't talked about that here. I guess that's not specifically an argument for theism. So yeah, like maybe half of these arguments he's studied in depth. I would say the other half, I see no evidence that he studied them in any depth, or at least engages with them in any depth. Anyway.
Very persuasive.
So roughly 3 decades ago, Alvin Plantinga gave a lecture called 24 or so Arguments. And then a book was published, kind of a compilation with a lot of these arguments after that. And it really helped motivate a generation of scholars to defend God's existence. Back to my first question to you about where we are at with these arguments. Alvin Plantinga played a massive role in that. I'm curious, how many good theistic arguments do you think there are beyond these 6 that are at least convincing? Would you put a number or an estimate on it? Like, how would you?
Why are we bothering to count arguments? This is like the silly video that Cameron did a few years ago now, where it was like 100-something arguments for God's existence. And then I did my sort of tongue-in-cheek 500 arguments against God's existence. Like the number of arguments is so irrelevant. Like what matters is whether they're good arguments and how good your explanatory model is for accounting for what we observe in the world is much more important than like how many ways can I formulate an argument. So it's just like, it's not Pokemon. You're not like trying to catch them all.
Land that plane if possible.
Oh man, I just don't know, Sean. Certainly there are many more good arguments for the existence of God than the ones that I've had time to work on in my finite lifetime. But I wouldn't be able to put a number on how many good arguments for God's existence there are.
That's fair. I suggested you might respond that way. I thought maybe he'll give me a number.
Because it's a dumb question. Like, what even if you thought there were lots of other arguments, you're not going to have a number. Like, it doesn't even make any sense to have a specific number.
But you're such a careful thinker and you studied these 6. So, you know, if Alvin Plantinga said it, in some ways that settles it, that minimally there's a lot more arguments than these 6. But I think you argue that these arguments themselves are sufficient, especially taken cumulatively. Maybe you could clarify for our viewers. You said earlier that you take these kind of one by one, but you also talk about how they're a cumulative case.
Yeah, well, I think we're going to stop there because I just can't deal with talking about a cumulative case. Cumulative case, in the way that apologist uses it, just means please don't press on any one argument too much. I'm just going to appeal to their collective sort of emergent force so that I don't have to defend anyone in too much detail. That's a bit of a straw man, but like I just think that that's actually how this cumulative case thing is used. Because if you have a good cumulative case, you don't really need to keep talking about it. You just present the case and like, it has the force that it has. Anyway, so shockingly, there was absolutely nothing new in that video that I hadn't already heard many times before. I didn't really expect that there would be, to be fair. You know, it was only 1 hour, but even so, you know, there's more that they could have done. In particular, he could have actually defended the premises of his arguments instead of going straight to objections. And oftentimes not even very good objections, in my opinion. Some of them were, some of them not so much. Like for example, the one we saw at the end with the ontological argument. I think one of the better objections to that is going to the anti-God version, like maximally evil being. There are tiebreakers that people have tried to come up with, but I actually think that that's quite a good objection. Or the maximally great pizza, like perfect islands and perfect pizzas, sort of parody versions of those arguments. But no, instead we got the, well, but it's conceivable that God doesn't exist, which, yeah, that's fine. But I think it's not as strong an objection. So even something like that, I think we didn't get the best objections. Now, of course, the best objections are to be found in my work. I think that there are some updates that I would make if I wrote this book today, but it's still a very good introduction to a lot of the main arguments that you hear, certainly Protestants give for the existence of God. Catholics sometimes frame things a little differently, but many of the arguments will be relevant there too. And yes, as I have just verified, there's been no fundamental changes in any of these arguments since the book came out. This was 8 years ago now, geez. So it's still very relevant. Recommend picking it up and having a look. You can get it for Kindle on only $6, so absolute bargain. And I obviously it's my book, so I'm going to say that, but I really do recommend it. I think that this is a really good guide to a lot of the common apologetic arguments. I focus mostly on fine-tuning, Kalam, moral and resurrection arguments, because those are the ones that Craig has most to say about. I do briefly discuss applicability of mathematics, intentionality, and I think the ontological argument as well. So yeah, check that out. I am currently, as I think I've mentioned a number of times, I'm currently working on a quasi sequel to the book, or at least another book, which is a defense of philosophical naturalism, which discusses philosophy of mathematics, philosophy of mind, and philosophy of ethics, like meta-ethics, essentially. So dealing with the main issues that people have with, as well as philosophy of physics and like what it is for things to be physical. So at some point soon, I will start to produce some summaries of some of those arguments as sort of an introduction to what the book's going to be about, and getting a bit of publicity there, because it's been a long time in the making. I've been working on it for about 5 years now, and obviously part-time, hence the slow pace, but it's coming along. And the first draft is probably about a third finished now. Rough though, we'll need quite a bit of polishing afterwards. But I have a very lengthy summary that's already completed and sets out the frame of all the things I'm going to be talking about. So that took most of the time. Anyway, so looking forward to that, because it's sort of an accompaniment as a criticism. The first book is a criticism of Christian apologetics, particularly as articulated by Craig, but honestly, the arguments don't differ that much across other apologists I've encountered. They're mostly the same. And then the second one will be a defense of a naturalistic worldview, which also addresses some of the other issues that come up, like how do you explain the mind, or how do you explain consciousness, or how do you explain morality, or how do you explain maths, or laws of nature and things like this. So anyway, what I try to do there, I think that the reason I mentioned that is what I try to do there is articulate a fairly specific view and give reasons for all of the positions that I take, and link it to what we know from science, and try to kind of bring things together and present it as a coherent and convincing viewpoint, perspective. What I don't try to do is like give you, like, here's 3 arguments for naturalism. The first argument has 3 premises. I mean, I might summarize arguments occasionally in that form, but I just don't think that's helpful. What we want to do is construct coherent worldviews that account for a range of phenomena in the world, and then explain why they're plausible and show that they have enough explanatory scope to account for the various phenomena that we see. And what frustrates me about Craig is that despite, his work in systematic theology, I think he's very bad at doing this, because mostly he presents things as these sort of modular arguments, and then just often refuses to really develop much of a theory about what he's talking about. I know he does that a bit more in his theological work, but even there, it's not. A lot of it is shifting the burden of proof onto the person who's the critic, and not actually providing a concrete theory himself, particularly in the apologetics work. So I think this is very unsatisfactory. And that's one of the reasons that I find Craig very, well, to be honest, most apologists do this as well. That's sort of the approach of apologetics, is to avoid having to shoulder as much burden as possible and just shift the burden onto the person who's critical. So just ask them, oh, so you don't think that so-and-so is morally wrong, or so you think that it's impossible that God exists, or how do you think the universe came into existence, and then just avoid having to actually defend anything themselves. Anyway, so that's all for today. Hopefully you found that interesting. Quick look at chat before we finish. Thanks everyone for coming, and those who contributed to the discussion. I swear you did about apologetics about populism, but I can't find it or his channel. Would you be able to repost also? Highly recommend your book. Thanks very much for the recommendation. So in terms of bad apologetics, I've mentioned this. No, actually, I don't think I've talked about this on my YouTube, so I'll address it now. So the bad apologetics videos are not currently online because they were hosted on Nathan's channel, Digital Gnosis. And he has posted about this on his Substack, so I'm not saying anything new here. So Nathan put up a video, I don't know, a month ago, in which he made some injudicious comments, and I won't say what they are or talk about them. You can look at Nathan's Substack if you're interested. That was picked up by a group of people who don't like him very much and shared it around. He got in trouble. As a result, he took down his channel. Now, I'm hoping that we can get those videos back up. I don't want to talk about the controversy itself for various reasons, but Nathan's addressed it on his Substack, so you can check that out if you're interested. I'm just telling you why you can't find the videos, because that's sort of important, because that's where all the bad apologetic videos were. They're not currently available, but the videos still exist, and they will be online again, hopefully in the not too distant future. So yeah, I'm not going to, I want to be clear. I don't want to get, it's a bit tricky here because I'm restricted in what I can say for various reasons. So I don't want to address the controversy here. If and when Nathan brings his channel back, maybe we can talk about it then. So I'm not making a comment about that. I'm just informing you as to what has happened about the videos, which is what I'm going to do that. If you want more, like, email me and I'm happy to talk about it in a more private format. But for various reasons, I want to be a bit cautious about what I say here. Anyway, so that's where those videos are. They will come back at some point, but in the meantime, we'll keep doing more content here. So thanks very much, everyone. Take care, and I'll talk to you soon.